Welcome, listeners, to a new journey into the unknown. This is Tales by Imon, and tonight, we venture into the static of the cosmos, searching for a whisper in the dark. Settle in as we begin our story, the radio signal from an unknown dimension. The universe is filled with noise. A constant, chaotic symphony of dying stars, colliding galaxies, and the faint, lingering echo of the Big Bang itself. For Dr. Adrian Vance, this noise was the soundtrack of his life. From his perch inside the control room of the forgotten Sentinel Peak Observatory, nestled deep in the arid plains of West Texas, his job was to listen, to sift through the cosmic static, hoping to find a single coherent note in the overwhelming orchestra of space. Most days, he found nothing. Today was not most days. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, a testament to the hours he'd spent staring at the cascading data on his monitors. Sentinel Peak wasn't a state-of-the-art facility anymore. It was a relic, a collection of aging radio telescopes that the larger, better-funded institutions had left behind. For Adrian, it was both a prison and a sanctuary. A prison because his once promising career had stalled here after he'd chased a controversial theory about extra-dimensional signals, a theory that had gotten him laughed out of more prestigious labs. A sanctuary because, out here, under the vast, unpolluted sky, he was free to listen to the cosmos without anyone telling him what he could and couldn't search for. He was running a standard diagnostic, calibrating the array's primary dish for a routine survey of the Perseus arm of the galaxy. It was mind-numbing work, the kind of task that allowed his thoughts to drift. He thought about Dr. Evelyn Reed, his former mentor, who had warned him against chasing ghosts in the data. "Focus on the tangible, Adrian," she had said, her voice a mixture of concern and disappointment. "The universe is wondrous enough without inventing new ones." That's when he saw it. A ghost. A flicker on the spectral analysis monitor, so faint it was almost imperceptible. A tiny, persistent spike in the 1420 MHz frequency band. The so-called waterhole frequency, a quiet neighborhood in the cosmic radio spectrum, long theorized as an ideal channel for interstellar communication. But this wasn't a powerful, deliberate broadcast from a distant star system. It was something else. It was quiet, shy, almost buried in the background radiation. Most automated systems would have dismissed it as statistical noise, a phantom generated by the aging equipment or atmospheric interference. But Adrian wasn't an automated system. His eyes, trained by years of looking for patterns in chaos, narrowed. He ran a quick check. The atmospheric sensors showed no anomalies. The telescope's internal diagnostics came back clean. The signal, faint as it was real. It was coming from a fixed point in the sky, a seemingly empty patch of space between the constellations of Orion and Taurus. There was nothing there. No notable stars, no nebulae, nothing that should be broadcasting a signal this clean. His heart began to beat a little faster. This was the feeling, the one he lived for. The thrill of the hunt. He rerouted processing power from two other telescopes in the array, linking them to the main dish and focusing all their collective power on that one empty spot in the sky. The signal-to-noise ratio began to improve, inch by painstaking inch. The ghostly spike on his monitor grew a little clearer, a little more defined. It was then that he noticed the structure. The signal wasn't a flat, monotonous tone. It pulsed. It had a rhythm, a cadence that was anything but natural. Natural cosmic signals, from pulsars, from quasars, had their own kinds of rhythm, but they were predictable, born of physical rotation or emission. This was different. It was complex, layered. There was a primary carrier wave, and nested within it were smaller, intricate pulses arranged in a non-random sequence. It was a pattern. An unmistakable, repeating pattern. Come on," Adrian whispered to himself, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He initiated a deep-level pattern recognition algorithm, a piece of software he'd written himself years ago to search for exactly this kind of structured, information-rich signal. The computer began to churn through the data, its fans whirring to life and breaking the dead silence of the control room. 4 minutes that stretched into an eternity, he watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. And then it was done. The results flashed on the screen, and the air left Adrian's lungs in a sudden rush. The algorithm had found a repeating sequence. A long, complex string of pulses that repeated, flawlessly, every 37.4 minutes. It was a signal. It was deliberate. It was artificial. It was a message. He leaned back in his worn-out chair, the springs groaning in protest. His mind was racing, trying to process the implications. For decades, humanity had been shouting into the void, sending our own signals out into the galaxy with a search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI. We had been listening for a reply. But we had always been listening for something from our universe, from a planet orbiting a star light years away. This felt different. The signal's properties were strange. It didn't exhibit the kind of Doppler shift he would expect from an object moving within our galaxy. Its polarization was twisted in a way that defied conventional astrophysics. It was as if the signal was coming from somewhere that wasn't bound by the same physical laws he knew. A cold dread mixed with the exhilarating thrill of discovery. His controversial theory, the one that had ruined his reputation, was that if another dimension existed, its presence might be detectable as a faint, structured signal leaking through the fabric of our own reality. A whisper from a room next door. He had been ridiculed for it. Now, the ghost he had been chasing for years was whispering back from his speakers. He isolated the core repeating sequence and converted the radio pulses into a simple audio signal. He put on his headphones, closed his eyes, and listened. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't music. It was a series of clicks and silences, a rhythmic, alien language spoken in the native tongue of mathematics and physics. Click, click, silence, click, 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 click. It was the most profound sound he had ever heard. He was alone, in the middle of the Texas desert, with the biggest secret in human history humming in his ears. He had found a signal. But as he looked at the data scrolling endlessly down his screen, a chilling thought settled upon him. The signal wasn't just coming from a distant star. It was coming from a place he couldn't point to on any map of the known universe. He hadn't just made contact with another world. He had found a crack in the wall of his own reality, and something on the other side was knocking. The question was no longer, are we alone? The question was, what is out there? Dawn broke over the West Texas plains, painting the dusty landscape in hues of orange and pink, but Adrian Vance didn't notice. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. The rhythmic clicking of the alien signal was a permanent echo in his mind, a cosmic heartbeat that had overshadowed his own. For hours, he had worked in a state of frenzied focus, his control room a chaotic nest of scrawled equations on whiteboards, empty coffee cups, and printouts of spectral data that carpeted the floor. The initial euphoria of discovery had given way to the cold, frantic urgency of a scientist on the brink. He had to prove it. Every new test he ran only deepened the mystery. He confirmed the signal's origin point with terrifying precision. It wasn't drifting as a planet or a ship would. It was locked in place, as if anchored to the very fabric of space-time. The strangest part remained the polarization, the orientation of the radio waves. It was cyclically shifting in a pattern that defied explanation by any known gravitational lensing or Faraday rotation. It was as if the signal was passing through a medium with physical properties that shouldn't exist. It was evidence, strong evidence, that supported his wildest, career-ending theory. But evidence was useless if he was the only one who saw it. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed more processing power, more observation time, and most importantly, validation. There was only one person at Sentinel Peak who could grant him that, Dr. Maya Collins, the observatory's director. Maya was a pragmatist, a brilliant astrophysicist whose work was grounded in hard, observable facts. She dealt in numbers and budgets, not in theoretical ghosts. She was the one who had to justify Sentinel Peak's meager existence to funding committees, and she had little patience for anything that couldn't produce peer-reviewed results. She was, in short, the last person who would be receptive to the idea that they were receiving a broadcast from another dimension. Taking a deep breath, Adrian gathered his most compelling printouts and walked the short distance to her office. He found her already at her desk, poring over budget projections. She looked up as he entered, her expression one of tired efficiency. "Adrian," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You look like you wrestled a black hole and lost. Don't tell me the main dish's cryo-cooler is acting up again." "The cooler is fine, Maya," he said, his voice hoarse from a night of disuse. "I've found something. Something important." He spread the charts across her desk. On top, he placed the spectral analysis showing the clear, structured spike at 1420 MHz. Maya picked it up, her eyes scanning the data with professional detachment. She pursed her lips. "It's a clean signal, I'll give you that. Very low noise floor. A bit too clean, maybe. Are you sure it's not internal interference? Maybe from the new network router they installed last week." "I've ruled all that out," Adrian insisted, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I've run every diagnostic I can think of. It's not local. It's not terrestrial. It's not from our solar system. Look at this." He handed her the next sheet, showing the repeating pattern. "It's structured. This isn't random noise, Maya. This is information." She studied the second page, a flicker of interest in her eyes, before her skepticism returned like a shield. "It's a pattern, yes. It could be a previously uncatalogued pulsar with a complex emission cycle. Or it could be a military satellite using a new encryption method. You know they test things out here over the desert all the time. She handed the papers back to him. It's an interesting anomaly, Adrian. Write it up, log it, and we'll look at it when we have some downtime next quarter. Next quarter. The words were incredulous. Maya, you're not hearing me. This isn't just an anomaly. The signal's properties are impossible. The polarization shift, the complete lack of a measurable Doppler effect. It's like the source isn't moving relative to us at all, which is impossible in an expanding universe. Everything moves. She finally leaned back, folding her arms and fixing him with a weary gaze. It was a look he knew well. It was the look that said she was treading carefully, trying to manage the eccentric theorist she'd been saddled with. Adrian, I respect your intuition, I really do. But your impossible is often a synonym for unexplained. And your history with unconventional theories is well documented. We have a grant-funded survey of the Perseus arm to complete. We are 2 months behind schedule as it is. I cannot justify redirecting our primary instruments for what is likely a ghost in the machine. He felt a flash of anger, the familiar sting of dismissal. So that's it. You're just going to ignore it because of my reputation. I'm going to prioritize our commitments, she corrected him firmly. I'm protecting this observatory. Chasing wild theories is a luxury we can't afford. He knew he was losing her. He had to give her something concrete, something that followed the scientific method to the letter. Okay, he said, changing tactics. Forget my theories. Let's stick to protocol. The next logical step for any unidentified signal is to confirm its celestial origin with a parallax test. That's just standard procedure. He pointed out the window towards the furthest dish of the array, 5 miles away on a distant mesa. All I need is 1 hour. Point dish 7 at the same coordinates. If the signal is truly coming from deep space, both dishes will receive it at virtually the same time. But if it's a local source, a military drone, a prankster with a transmitter, anything on or near Earth, dish 7 will detect a slight time delay, a microscopic shift in phase, because of the distance between the 2 dishes. It's the most basic test there is. 1 hour, Maya. That's all I ask. If the parallax test comes back negative, I'll drop it. I'll go back to the Perseus survey and I will not mention this again. Maya was silent for a long moment, staring at him. He was offering her a scientific, falsifiable proposition. It was a reasonable request. It was also a direct challenge to her authority, and a waste of precious resources if he was wrong. The tension in the small office was thick enough to feel. Her entire demeanor was a battle between scientific curiosity and pragmatic duty. Finally, she let out a long, slow sigh. 1 hour, Vance, she said, her voice sharp with resignation. You get exactly 1 hour of dish 7's time. I'll have to log it as a calibration alignment, so I hope for your sake this works. But know this, if that test shows any phase delay at all, anything that points to a local source, you're on administrative review. I will not have this facility's reputation jeopardized. Am I clear? Crystal, Adrian said, a wave of relief washing over him. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only one he had. He turned and walked out of her office without another word, his mind already racing. He didn't just need to be right. He needed to prove it, right now. He hurried back to the control room, Maya following a few paces behind him, her arms still crossed, her expression a mask of professional doubt. He sat at his console, his hands hovering over the controls. He typed in the command sequence to slew dish 7 to the precise coordinates. On the main screen, a camera view showed the massive, distant dish beginning to move, its white surface turning slowly to face that empty patch of sky. The fate of his discovery, his career, and a truth too vast to comprehend now rested on a few photons of light traveling across 5 miles of desert. He initiated the link, and 2 sets of data began to stream onto the monitor, side by side. All they could do now was wait. The control room of the Sentinel Peak Observatory, usually a place of quiet, methodical work, was now a theater of profound silence. The only sounds were the soft hum of the servers and the frantic thumping of Adrian's own heart. He and Maya stood side by side, their eyes locked on the central monitor where the 2 data streams from dish 1 and dish 7 flowed in parallel. The parallax correlation software was running its analysis, comparing every single pulse, every waveform, every infinitesimal fluctuation between the 2 signals. It was a digital trial, and Adrian's entire world was the defendant. Maya was rigid, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She expected a discrepancy, a small but fatal phase shift that would prove the signal was a local ghost, a phantom born of radio waves bouncing around the West Texas desert. Adrian just held his breath, a prayer caught in his throat. This was it. The moment where his discovery either became the single greatest event in human history or the final, embarrassing footnote on a failed career. The progress bar hit 100%. A small chime, usually ignored, echoed through the tense room. The results appeared on the screen in stark, white text against a black background. Signal correlation analysis complete. Phase coherence, 99.999%. Parallax measurement, less than 0.001 arcseconds, statistically zero. Source classification, extrasolar, deep space. Adrian stared, his mind struggling to catch up with his eyes. Statistically zero. No parallax. The signal was coming from a source so unimaginably distant that the 5-mile gap between the two massive telescopes was meaningless. It was not a satellite. It was not a military experiment. It was not of this Earth. He had been right. A slow, shaky smile spread across his face as relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over him. He felt a dizzying sense of vindication that was so intense it almost brought him to his knees. He glanced at Maya. The mask of skepticism on her face had shattered. Her jaw was slightly slack, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. She stared at the screen, then at Adrian, then back at the screen, as if trying to force the numbers to change, to revert to something that made sense in her ordered, predictable world. But the data was absolute. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she took a step closer to the monitor and whispered a single word. Impossible. I told you, Adrian said, his voice barely more than a whisper itself. The spell of silence broke. Maya's mind, a formidable instrument of scientific inquiry, rebooted. Her shock morphed into a rapid-fire cascade of questions, her earlier skepticism replaced by a fierce, electrifying curiosity. Okay, she said, turning to him, her eyes burning with intensity. Okay, deep space. So what are we looking at? What's its signal strength at the source? We can extrapolate its power output if we can get a distance estimate, but how can we get a distance estimate with no redshift? Have you analyzed the bandwidth? What's the information density? Have you tried applying any standard decryption protocols? Lempel Ziv. Shannon Fano. Adrian was taken aback by the sudden shift. He was no longer a pariah, he was a colleague. The signal is incredibly weak, almost lost in the cosmic microwave background. The power source would have to be astronomical. As for decryption, he gestured to a secondary monitor filled with lines of nonsensical symbols. I've tried everything. Every standard model. Nothing works. It's just gibberish. The message isn't in the pulses themselves, or at least, not only in the pulses. I think the information is encoded in the polarization. Maya leaned in, studying the polarization data. That's insane, she murmured, tracing the complex sine wave patterns with her finger. The level of control required to encode data this way, it's light years beyond our technology. It's like trying to carve a sculpture on the head of a pin while it's being fired from a cannon. For the next several hours, the two of them worked in a seamless, frenetic partnership. Maya's pragmatism was the perfect anchor for Adrian's intuitive leaps. She organized their approach, dedicating server clusters to run analyses while Adrian searched for patterns, for anything that felt familiar in the alien stream of data. They were a two-person team against the greatest enigma humanity had ever faced. But the signal guarded its secrets well. Every attempt to decode it was a failure. The message remained locked away, a tantalizing whisper from an intelligence so advanced it might as well have been magic. Frustrated, they took a break, staring at the whiteboard Adrian had covered in diagrams of the polarization shifts. It's like a language with no Rosetta Stone, Maya said, rubbing her temples. We can see that it's a language, we can see the grammar, the structure. But we don't have a single word to translate. Adrian stared at the looping, intricate patterns he had drawn. Maybe we're trying to read sentences when we should be looking for the alphabet, he thought aloud. He traced one of the more complex repeating patterns. There was something about its geometry, the way it spiraled and branched. It wasn't random. It reminded him of something he'd studied years ago, a subject that had been another of his academic obsessions, quantum fractal mathematics, a purely theoretical field that described geometric patterns that retained their complexity at any scale, governed by the strange rules of quantum probability. Maya, he said slowly, an idea taking shape in his mind. This looks like a fractal. Specifically, a Mandelbrot set, but twisted, as if it's being projected from a higher dimension. Maya looked at him, skepticism warring with curiosity. You want to apply a fractal decryption key? Adrian, that's purely theoretical. Everything about this is theoretical, he countered, a new energy in his voice. The signal is the proof. What if their mathematics are fundamentally based on this geometry? What if this pattern isn't just a container for the data? What if the pattern is the data? It was a long shot, a wild guess born of desperation and intuition. But it was the only new idea they had. Working together, they began to write a new decryption filter, not based on binary code or frequency modulation, but on the complex mathematical principles of a quantum fractal. It took 2 hours to build the algorithm. When it was ready, they selected a single, small segment of the signal, just a few seconds of the broadcast, and applied the filter. The computer began to process the request. It was a far more intensive calculation than the previous attempts. Seconds felt like minutes. Finally, the process completed. A new window opened on the screen, and a single line of text appeared. It wasn't gibberish. It was a clean, ordered sequence of numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 23. They both stared at it. Prime numbers, Maya breathed. It's a sequence of primes. The universal language. Mathematics. It was the classic hello that scientists had long hoped to receive from an alien intelligence. A sign of common ground. But Adrian's eyes were fixed on the middle of the sequence. He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Look," he said, his voice tight. "Look at the numbers." Maya looked closer. Her brow furrowed in confusion. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 15. Wait a minute. 15 isn't a prime number. It's divisible by 3 and 5. And 21 is in the sequence further down. And 33. It was true. The sequence was a list of prime numbers as humanity understood them, but it was interspersed with other numbers, composites, that were presented with the same logical weight, as if they, too, were fundamental, indivisible building blocks. They were staring at the first translated message from another intelligence, a message that started with a simple mathematical sequence, but a sequence that broke the fundamental laws of their own mathematics. It was a greeting that was also a paradox. A message they could read, but an idea they could not possibly understand. The beings on the other end of the signal didn't just live in another place. They lived in a reality that operated on a different set of rules. And they had just sent the first page of their physics textbook. The impossible sequence of prime numbers burned on the monitor, a defiant statement against everything Adrian and Maya knew to be true. The number 15, sitting calmly between 13 and 17, felt like a deliberate provocation, a mathematical joke from a cosmic prankster. But this was no joke. It was the first coherent syllable spoken to humanity by another intelligence, and it was a syllable of pure paradox. The sun was now fully risen, casting long shadows across the control room floor, but for the two scientists, it was still the dead of night, a time of profound and terrifying revelation. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Fueled by a mixture of stale coffee and pure adrenaline, they spent the next several hours applying their new fractal-based decryption key to other segments of the signal. Each successful decryption was like opening a new page in a book that was supposed to be identical to their own, only to find that every other word had been changed. They uncovered a value for pi that began normally, 3.14159, but deviated in the thousandth decimal place. They found a value for the fine structure constant, the fundamental number that governs the strength of electromagnetic interaction, that was subtly but significantly different. It was a complete, internally consistent model of a universe. It had its own mathematics, its own physics, its own fundamental constants. It was a universe that was almost, but not quite, like their own. "They're not just sending us a message," Maya said, her voice strained with a lack of sleep and an abundance of awe. "They're sending us the source code for their reality." "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Adrian murmured, tracing the alien equations on the whiteboard. "Think of the possibilities, Maya. A universe with slightly different rules. What would that allow? Faster than light travel? Access to zero-point energy? It's a key. They're handing us a key to unlock a new understanding of everything." But Maya's initial excitement had cooled, replaced by a deep and unsettling caution. She stood by the window, looking out at the familiar solid landscape of the Texas desert, a landscape governed by the unwavering laws of physics she had dedicated her life to understanding. "Or it's a weapon, Adrian," she said quietly, her reflection a faint ghost in the glass. "You don't just hand someone a different set of physical laws as a greeting card. That's not a conversation. That's a contamination." Adrian turned from the whiteboard. "What are you talking about? This is knowledge. It's pure data." "Is it?" she countered, turning to face him. "Think about it. What happens when you introduce a foreign element into a stable ecosystem? The system either rejects it, or it's irrevocably changed. What happens when you introduce a piece of code from another operating system into your own? It crashes. We're looking at the operating system of the universe, and we've just received a virus. What if this knowledge isn't meant to be read? What if it's meant to be executed? Her words hung in the air, chilling the room more effectively than the overworked air conditioner. A Trojan horse. A message designed not to inform, but to transform, to overwrite. The beauty Adrian saw in the elegant, alien equations suddenly seemed sinister. For the first time, he felt a genuine flicker of fear. This discovery was bigger than them. It was bigger than any government or organization on Earth. The potential for misuse, or even for accidental catastrophe, was staggering. "You're right," he said, the excitement draining from him, replaced by the heavy weight of responsibility. "No one can know about this. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." They made a pact, there in the quiet dawn of the control room. A pact of silence. They were the sole guardians of this secret, the keepers of a flame that could either illuminate humanity's future or burn their world to the ground. Their work became a clandestine operation. To the outside world, they went back to their duties. Adrian logged routine data from the Perseus survey. Maya filed budget reports and equipment requisitions. But every night, after the rest of the small observatory staff had gone home, they would descend back into the rabbit hole. Maya, with her methodical mind, took charge of security. She created a completely isolated network for their research, a digital island disconnected from the internet and the observatory's main servers. She wiped the original discovery logs, burying the alien signal under layers of fabricated calibration data. She ensured that their work left no trace, that no curious outsider could ever stumble upon it. While Maya built their digital fortress, Adrian focused on the signal itself. He set the decryption algorithm to run on a continuous, massive block of the broadcast, a full 24 hours of data. It was a processing task that would take days to complete, but he hoped that a larger sample size would reveal the message's true intent. Was it a greeting? A warning? A history of their universe? He had to know why. Why send this message at all? 3 days later, the process was complete. Adrian was alone in the control room, monitoring the final stages, when the notification popped up. He called Maya on their secure line. "It's done," he said, his voice tense. "The long-range decryption is finished." A few minutes later, she hurried into the room, her expression anxious. Together, they looked at the screen. The results were not a physics textbook. It was not a history or a philosophical text. The initial part of the data stream was, as they'd seen, a primer, an alphabet of alien mathematics and physics. But it was just the introduction. The main body of the message, the vast bulk of the information, was something else entirely. The screen was filled with diagrams. Complex, rotating, three-dimensional schematics that shimmered with an eerie light. They showed intricate components, lattices of exotic matter, and pathways for energies they couldn't begin to name. Nested within the images were annotations, written in the same alien mathematics they were just beginning to understand. It was unmistakably a blueprint. A detailed, step-by-step set of instructions. Adrian zoomed in on one component, a central power core that seemed to bend the light around it on the screen. Maya pointed to another section, a series of interlocking rings that pulsed in a complex rhythm. Their purpose was a mystery, but the intent was not. The signal wasn't a key. It wasn't a virus. It was a recipe. They stared in stunned silence, the rhythmic clicking of the signal from the speakers suddenly sounding less like a greeting and more like a command. The message from the unknown dimension, the whisper from a reality next door, was not an invitation to talk. It was a set of instructions on how to build a doorway. The schematics on the screen were a silent, hypnotic dance of light and geometry. For 2 days, Adrian and Maya barely moved, caught in the intellectual gravity of the alien blueprint. They were like two Neolithic shamans staring at the plans for a nuclear reactor, able to grasp the shapes and the connections but utterly ignorant of the deep, physical principles at play. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to decipher small pieces of the grand design, translating the alien mathematics into approximations of their own. Their discoveries were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The device was not a simple machine with a singular purpose. It was a multi-stage, dynamic system. The central core, which they nicknamed the heart, was designed to generate a localized, high-frequency gravitational field. "It's a space-time resonator," Maya explained, her voice a hushed whisper of disbelief as she pointed to a complex equation. According to this, when activated, it's designed to vibrate at a specific frequency. Not through air, not through space, but to vibrate the fabric of reality itself. "Like ringing a bell to get the attention of the house next door," Adrian added, the analogy sending a chill down his spine. The outer rings, it seemed, were meant to be a containment and focusing system, a way to ensure the vibration was controlled, to prevent it from catastrophically tearing their own reality apart at the seams. It was a machine of breathtaking elegance and unimaginable power. But the blueprint gave no clear indication of its ultimate purpose. Was it a communications device, meant to amplify their ability to listen? A power source? A transport system? Or was it, as Maya's earlier fear suggested, a doomsday weapon? The ambiguity was a form of psychological torture. The weight of their secret had become immense, a physical presence in the small control room. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that the inevitable debate began. It started late one night, with Adrian staring at the glowing schematics, his eyes filled with a dangerous mix of wonder and ambition. "We have to try," he said, the words cutting through the silence. "We have to understand what this is." Maya, who was running a diagnostic on the potential energy output of the heart, froze. "Understand it? Adrian, we can't understand it. We are looking at a masterclass in physics from a civilization that is potentially a billion years ahead of us. To them, these blueprints are probably the equivalent of a child's science fair project. To us, they are a loaded gun with no safety, and we don't even know which end the bullet comes out of." "So we do nothing," he challenged, turning to face her. "We just sit on the most important discovery in history? We let it fade away on an encrypted hard drive? What if this machine is the answer, Maya? The answer to everything? Clean energy, faster than light travel, cures for diseases. This knowledge doesn't just belong to us. We have a moral obligation to explore it. We have a moral obligation to survive," she shot back, her voice rising with passion and fear. "Our primary duty as scientists, as human beings, is to do no harm. You're talking about building a machine that literally shakes the foundations of the universe. What if turning it on is a cataclysm? What if it's not a gateway, but a self-destruct button for our entire solar system? The risk is infinite. We don't have the right to gamble with every life on this planet based on your scientific curiosity." Her words hit their mark. Adrian sank back into his chair, the conflict raging within him. She was right. The risk was incalculable, but the potential reward was equally so. For hours they argued, their partnership, forged in the thrill of discovery, now strained by the terrifying weight of decision. The debate, however, was almost academic. As they dug deeper into the blueprints, they hit a wall that seemed insurmountable: the materials. The machine required substances that did not exist on any periodic table. The primary structure called for a crystalline alloy of carbon and silicon, but one that was stabilized in a quantum-locked state, giving it a tensile strength 1,000 times greater than diamond. The conduit rings required woven filaments of what the alien mathematics described as one-dimensional matter. It was a shopping list from an impossible store. Defeated, Adrian slumped over the console. "It's useless then," he said, the energy finally gone from his voice. "They've sent us a recipe that requires ingredients from their universe, not ours. It was never meant to be built." Maya, ever the analyst, continued to sift through the data, unwilling to leave any stone unturned. "Wait a minute," she said slowly. "Look at this subfile here, cross-referenced with the material fabrication section." She brought up a new diagram on the screen. It was smaller, less complex. It showed how a powerful, precisely shaped electromagnetic field could be used to bombard a lattice of graphene, forcing its atoms to temporarily fold into a higher dimensional plane. If the process was stable, the result would be a microscopic flake of the quantum-locked carbon-silicon alloy they needed. "It's a recipe," Maya breathed. "A recipe for the ingredients. The machine is designed to help build itself." The process was outrageously complex and would require more power than the entire observatory could draw from the state's electrical grid. But the first step, creating a single microscopic flake of the material, was, in theory, achievable. It would require a piece of hyper-specialized equipment they didn't have, a tunable quantum cascade fabricator, a device capable of creating the exotic electromagnetic fields the process demanded. Such machines were rare, incredibly expensive, and found only in the most advanced corporate and military research labs in the world. The impasse had been broken, replaced by a new, terrifyingly practical path forward. The debate was no longer abstract. They reached a fragile, unspoken consensus. They would not attempt to build the machine, but they had to know if it could be built. They would attempt the first, single step. They would try to follow the recipe and create one microscopic, impossible flake of alien material. But that was impossible here. They needed resources, equipment, and a level of funding that was far beyond their reach. They needed a partner, someone with the means and the mindset to take such an insane risk. As they sat in the silence, contemplating their next move, a name from Adrian's past surfaced in his mind. a brilliant, eccentric, and utterly reckless physicist he had known in graduate school, a man who had dropped out to chase a wild theory and, against all odds, had used it to build a tech empire before disappearing from public life. A man who was rumored to have a private research facility that rivaled Los Alamos. There might be someone, Adrian said quietly, the name tasting strange on his lips after so many years. Someone who wouldn't be afraid of this. Someone who has the resources and might just be crazy enough to help. He turned to his personal computer, bypassing Maya's secure network, and logged into an old, encrypted email account. He typed a name into the search bar, a name the world hadn't heard in nearly a decade, Julian Croft. Finding him would be difficult. Convincing him would be impossible. But as Adrian looked at the alien schematics glowing on the main screen, he knew they had no other choice. Making contact was a monumental risk. It would mean their secret was no longer their own. It was the first step out of the shadows, a step from which there would be no return. Crafting the message to Julian Croft was like trying to solve a puzzle with infinite solutions. Adrian sat before his keyboard for nearly an hour, typing and deleting, agonizing over every word. How could he convey the monumental nature of his discovery without sounding like a madman? How could he capture the attention of a reclusive billionaire who had intentionally severed all ties with the world? Revealing too much was a security risk. Revealing too little would be ignored. In the end, he settled on a message that was both cryptic and deeply personal. He didn't mention a signal or a blueprint. Instead, he referenced a specific all-night argument they'd had in the university library 2 decades ago, a debate over a wildly speculative paper on the theoretical possibility of metamaterials, substances whose properties were defined by their structure, not their composition. At the time, they had dreamed of creating materials that could bend light, warp gravity, or even challenge the laws of thermodynamics. Julian, he wrote, it's been a long time. I'm writing because I think I found a practical application for our old discussion on engineered physics. It's not theoretical anymore. I have data that suggests the laws of nature are more flexible than we ever imagined. I believe I have found something real. Thought you might be the only person on the planet who would understand. He signed it simply, Adrian, and with a deep breath, sent the email to the last known address for Croft Industries, a digital message in a bottle cast into an ocean of silence. Days turned into a week. The silence from Julian was deafening. Adrian and Maya fell into a state of limbo, their secret work at a standstill, their future hanging on a reply that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The hope that had briefly surged within them began to fade, replaced by the grim acceptance that they were on their own. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, as Adrian was logging false data from the Perseus survey, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger. It resolved into a sleek, black sedan, the kind of vehicle that had no business being on the rough, unpaved road leading to Sentinel Peak. It rolled to a stop in front of the observatory's main building, its tinted windows revealing nothing of who was inside. A woman in a tailored black suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, stepped out of the driver's side. She moved with an unnerving efficiency, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She entered the control room without a word, her gaze falling directly on Adrian. "Dr. Adrian Vance?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. Adrian nodded, his heart beginning to pound. The woman produced a thin, metallic tablet, no bigger than a postcard, and handed it to him. "Mr. Croft invites you to have a conversation," she said. Adrian took the tablet. Its surface was cool and seamless. As his fingers touched it, the screen flickered to life, displaying only 2 things: a set of GPS coordinates pointing to a remote location in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, and a countdown timer. 23 hours, 59 minutes, 58 seconds. The woman gave a slight nod. "The invitation is for you and your collaborator, Dr. Collins. A car will be waiting for you at the rendezvous point. If you are not there when the timer reaches 0, the invitation is rescinded. Mr. Croft does not make offers twice." And with that, she turned, walked back to her car, and drove off, leaving Adrian and Maya in a cloud of dust and stunned silence. The decision was instantaneous. There was no other path forward. They spent the next hour fabricating a story for the rest of the staff about a sudden family emergency that required them both to leave immediately. They packed a single bag each, but their most precious cargo was a heavily encrypted, solid-state hard drive containing all their research on the signal. Driving Maya's beat-up sedan, they left Sentinel Peak behind, the radio telescopes shrinking in their rearview mirror. The journey was a long, tense passage through the changing landscape of the American Southwest. The flat, arid plains of Texas gave way to the rugged, rising peaks of Colorado. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, the reality of their situation settling in. They were no longer just scientists, they were conspirators, driving headlong into a future they could not predict. Following the tablet's guidance, they arrived at the coordinates with 3 hours to spare. The location was nothing more than a dusty, abandoned-looking scenic overlook on a remote mountain pass. As the countdown on the tablet neared its final hour, a black, rugged-looking SUV, identical to the one that had visited the observatory, arrived. The same stoic woman was behind the wheel. She instructed them to leave their car and their phones. "Mr. Croft values his privacy," was her only explanation. She drove them another 20 miles up a private, unmarked road, ending at a sheer rock face that looked like a natural part of the mountain. The driver pressed a hidden panel, and a section of the rock wall slid away with a silent hydraulic hiss, revealing a tunnel bathed in soft, white light. They drove into the heart of the mountain. The facility within was a testament to what unlimited resources and a brilliant, unrestrained mind could create. It was not a billionaire's mansion, but a pristine, subterranean laboratory that made Sentinel Peak look like a blacksmith shop. Automated drones zipped silently through the high-ceilinged corridors. Staff in clean, white lab coats moved with quiet purpose. It was a cathedral of science, built in secret. They were led to a vast central atrium, a circular room whose walls were a seamless, panoramic screen currently displaying a live feed of the Earth as seen from orbit. In the center of the room, standing before a floating, holographic interface, was Julian Croft. He hadn't changed much physically. He was still thin, with the same restless energy and eyes that seemed to be analyzing everything at once. He wore simple gray trousers and a black t-shirt, the uniform of a man who had nothing to prove. He turned as they entered, a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he looked at Adrian. "Vance," he said, his voice a dry, amused baritone. "I haven't heard that name since you decided to commit career suicide chasing dimensional static. Your email was the first interesting thing to cross my desk in 5 years." He gestured around the atrium. "As you can see, I've been keeping busy with my own projects. But they've grown predictable." He looked from Adrian to Maya, his gaze sharp and assessing. "So, you mentioned engineered physics. A bold claim. Show me something that isn't predictable." This was the moment. There would be no easing into it, no small talk. Adrian and Maya exchanged a final, resolute glance. This was the point of no return. Adrian stepped forward, pulling the encrypted hard drive from his pocket. "We didn't bring a theory, Julian," he said. He connected the drive to Julian's holographic interface. With a few keystrokes, he bypassed the images of the schematics and the complex physics. He wanted to start at the beginning, with a single piece of data that had broken their reality. The first message. He brought up the impossible prime number sequence. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 15, 17. "We didn't come to talk about engineering physics," Adrian said, his voice steady and clear. "We came to show you the instruction manual." Julian Croft leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the impossible numbers floating in the air in front of him. The bored, detached mask of the reclusive billionaire dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of raw, predatory focus. It was the look of a grandmaster who had just been shown a move he had never conceived of. For the first time in years, Julian Croft was looking at something he truly did not understand. And he was captivated. Julian Croft's fascination was a palpable force in the room. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the impossible sequence of prime numbers floating in the holographic display, his head tilted slightly, like a predator assessing unfamiliar prey. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Adrian and Maya exchanged an uneasy glance. They had expected shock, excitement, perhaps even disbelief. They were not prepared for the cold, analytical fire that ignited in Julian's eyes. When he finally moved, it was with explosive speed. He didn't ask about aliens or dimensions. He attacked the science. "Show me the raw data," he commanded, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, pulling up new windows. "All of it. I want to see the signal acquisition logs, the initial spectral analysis, the full waveform." For the next hour, he subjected them to the most intense peer review of their lives. It was a relentless intellectual assault. He was no longer a reclusive billionaire. He was a master physicist, dissecting their work with surgical precision. "Why this frequency? What's the declination and right ascension of the source? You're claiming zero Doppler shift. Over what observation period? Did you account for gravitational blue shifting from galactic clusters along the signal path?" This was Julian's test. He wasn't questioning the authenticity of their claim. He was testing the integrity of their science. He was looking for holes, for sloppiness, for any sign that they were amateurs who had stumbled onto something they didn't understand. Maya met his challenge head-on. She was in her element now, dealing not with terrifying theories, but with hard, verifiable data. She calmly and methodically presented the evidence. The parallax test was conclusive, run over a 5-mile baseline with a phase coherence of 99.999%. The observation period for the Doppler measurement has been continuous for 184 hours, and the signal has not deviated by a single hertz. We've accounted for all known atmospheric and gravitational effects. The signal is clean. When Julian turned his attention to the decryption key, Adrian stepped in. The fractal model was an intuitive leap, Adrian admitted, based on the geometry of the polarization shifts. But it's a model that works. It consistently turns structured noise into coherent mathematical and physical language. We didn't invent the key, we discovered the lock it fits. Julian fell silent again, his eyes flicking back and forth between the raw data and the decoded prime sequence. He had thrown every conventional explanation at their discovery, and everyone had bounced off the hard wall of their meticulous work. He nodded slowly, a single, sharp gesture of acceptance. The interrogation was over. They had passed. "All right," he said, his tone shifting from adversarial to collaborative. "You have an internally consistent signal of unknown origin with non-standard physics. Show me the rest of it." With a renewed sense of confidence, Adrian brought up the main prize. The schematics. The vast, empty atrium was suddenly filled with the intricate, rotating blueprint of the space-time resonator. The glowing lines and impossible shapes twisted in the air around them, a silent testament to an intelligence beyond their own. Julian walked a slow circle around the holographic model, his expression unreadable. He wasn't overwhelmed like Adrian, or fearful like Maya. He looked at the alien device with the focused, appraising eye of an engineer. He zoomed in on the central power core, then on the interlocking containment rings. "The power requirements are absurd," he murmured to himself. The energy shielding needed to prevent catastrophic gamma-ray emission would have to be novel. He looked at the annotations written in the alien math. And these fabrication tolerances are subatomic. Building this isn't a question of money. It's a question of manufacturing capabilities that don't exist. He finally stopped and turned to them, a strange, hungry light in his eyes. "For 20 years, he said, his voice quiet but intense, "I've been solving problems that were merely hard. I built a global data network. I created predictive AIs. I revolutionized battery technology. It was all just optimization. Taking what we knew and making it 1% better. It was boring." He gestured with his chin towards the shimmering blueprint. This is not hard. This is impossible. And for the first time in a very long time, I am genuinely interested." This was the answer they had traveled 1,000 miles to hear. A wave of relief washed over Adrian. Maya, despite her deep-seated fears, felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone in this anymore. "So you'll help us?" Maya asked, needing to hear the words. "Help you?" Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Dr. Collins, I'm taking over. Your lives as underfunded, unknown astronomers are over. As of this moment, you work for me. You will live here, at this facility. We will divert Sentinel Peak's telemetry to a remote server and run it on a loop, making it appear that you are still performing your duties. No one will know you're gone. Your singular focus, from this day forward, is the translation of these blueprints. My teams and I will handle the rest." He swiped his hand, and the image of the blueprint vanished, replaced by a new schematic. "We'll need to establish a secure communication line back to your array. We need to keep listening to the signal. It might be transmitting updates, diagnostics, who knows." He then led them from the atrium, down a long white corridor to a massive, blast-proof door. "My resources are now your resources. My staff is your staff. But my rules are absolute. Total secrecy. Nothing leaves this facility. Are we clear?" Adrian and Maya both nodded. The door hissed open, revealing a space that took their breath away. It was an enormous, subterranean cavern, easily the size of an aircraft hangar, hollowed out of the mountain's granite core. It was empty, a vast, silent, concrete space waiting to be filled. High above, a complex network of cranes and gantries stood ready. "This is Sublevel Gamma, my private workshop," Julian announced, his voice echoing in the immense chamber. "It is electromagnetically shielded, seismically isolated, and invisible to any surveillance I know of. This is where we stop talking about theory and start building." He turned to them, a brilliant, almost manic grin spreading across his face. "Welcome to the project. Our first order of business will be to build our own quantum cascade fabricator. According to your alien friends," he said, tapping a tablet he held, "they've provided a rather elegant and efficient design right here in Appendix 7. Adrian and Maya stood on the threshold, staring into the vast, empty space. The scale of their undertaking, of their gamble, finally crashed down upon them. They were no longer just academics who had found an anomaly. They were architects of the impossible, standing in the workshop where they would either build the future or break the world. Their new lives began in the sterile, silent heart of the mountain. The transition was abrupt and absolute. One day, Adrian and Maya were astronomers, living under the vast, open sky of West Texas. The next, they were inhabitants of sub-level Gamma, a self-contained world of recycled air, artificial sunlight, and the ever-present, low hum of cutting-edge technology. The sun and stars were replaced by biometric schedules and progress reports. They lived in minimalist but comfortable quarters, saw the same handful of faces from Julian's elite team each day, and breathed an atmosphere of intense, singular purpose. The outside world, with its politics, weather, and trivialities, ceased to exist. The first few weeks were a blur of integration and planning. The cavernous construction bay, once empty and silent, was transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Massive pieces of equipment were lowered by cranes from hidden access tunnels. Teams of engineers and physicists, all handpicked by Julian for their skill and discretion, moved with quiet efficiency. They had all signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements and were told only what they needed to know. They were working on a next-generation energy source. Only the three of them, Adrian, Maya, and Julian, knew the project's true, alien origins. Adrian's role became that of a high priest and translator. He spent his days and nights immersed in the alien signal, discovering that the blueprint was far more than a simple schematic. It was a living document. The alien mathematics was a contextual language, where the meaning of symbols and equations shifted subtly depending on their placement and proximity to others. It was a language of relationships, not of rigid definitions. A diagram for a power conduit would contain elements of the physics of the energy it was meant to carry. It was less like reading a blueprint, and more like learning to interpret a symphony. His work was slow, painstaking, and utterly vital. A single misinterpreted symbol could lead to a catastrophic design flaw. Maya, in turn, found her calling as the project's scientific conscience. Her deep-seated fear of the unknown was channeled into an obsessive, rigorous demand for safety and precision. She became the bridge between Adrian's esoteric translations and the practical world of engineering. She triple-checked every calculation, designed redundant safety protocols, and personally oversaw the assembly of the most critical components. While Julian was the engine of the project and Adrian was the navigator, Maya was the braking system, ensuring their relentless forward momentum didn't drive them off a cliff. Their first great task was the construction of the quantum cascade fabricator. It was a machine designed to build the impossible, and building it was a monumental challenge in itself. Following Adrian's translations, Julian's teams began the assembly. They machined unique alloys that had to be cooled to near absolute zero to maintain their structural integrity. They wound miles of superconducting wire into intricate magnetic focusing coils. They built a power regulation system the size of a small house, designed to channel and shape petawatts of energy into a perfectly controlled, microscopic point. Months passed in a feverish haze of work. The machine took shape in the center of the bay, a complex and beautiful sculpture of polished metal, crystalline structures, and glowing conduits. It stood 3 stories tall, a silent, alien altar in their subterranean cathedral. Finally, the day of the first test arrived. The construction bay was cleared. Adrian, Maya, and Julian stood in a heavily shielded control room overlooking the machine. The air was thick with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "All systems are green," Maya reported, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Safety interlocks are engaged. We are ready for a low-power activation." Julian gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the fabricator. "Bring it online, Dr. Collins." Maya initiated the sequence. A low hum emanated from the machine, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Lights flickered to life along its conduits, and the air around the central chamber began to shimmer, a visible heat haze caused by the intense electromagnetic forces being brought to bear. On the central monitor, a graph showed the field's strength climbing, the shape of the waveform a perfect match to the alien design. It was working. They had taken a piece of alien thought, translated it into human action, and created a functioning piece of impossible technology. A quiet cheer went up from the few engineers in the control room. Adrian felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a feeling of having connected with the intelligence that had sent the signal. For a brief moment, Maya allowed herself a small, relieved smile. They had done it. It was in that moment of triumph that a soft, insistent alarm began to chime from a small, private console near Julian's station. It wasn't one of the lab's alarms. It was something else. Julian's eyes darted to the screen and his celebratory expression vanished, replaced by a mask of cold concern. He quickly typed a command, and the alarm was silenced. What was that? Maya asked, her attention diverted from the fabricator's successful test. Nothing, Julian replied, a little too quickly. Geological sensor. Probably flagged the power draw as a minor seismic event. The mountain is full of them. But Adrian saw the look on his face. Julian was lying. He glanced over Julian's shoulder at the screen before it went blank. He saw only a glimpse of a world map, with orbital paths highlighted in red, but it was enough. The paths were converging on their location. The joy of their success instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling paranoia. Their secret workshop, buried deep within a mountain, was not as invisible as they had believed. The activation of the fabricator, their first tentative step in building the alien device, had not gone unnoticed. It had been a whisper, a flicker of impossible energy in a world that was constantly being watched. And now, something or someone was turning its gaze toward them. Julian turned away from his console, his jaw tight. He looked at the beautiful glowing machine they had just brought to life, and then at the concerned faces of Adrian and Maya. The rules of the game had just changed. Our timeline just got shorter, he said, his voice a low, grim acknowledgement of their new reality. We need to work faster. Their race to understand the signal from another dimension had just become a race against being discovered by their own. The triumph of activating the fabricator was fleeting, instantly eclipsed by the cold shadow of Julian's warning. The atmosphere in sub-level Gamma underwent a chemical change. The spirit of pure, unbridled scientific discovery was contaminated by the paranoia of a clandestine operation. The hum of the facility, once a comforting sound of progress, now seemed to carry a note of anxious urgency. They were no longer just scientists on the verge of a breakthrough. They were fugitives hiding a secret from the most powerful eyes on the planet. Julian moved with a cold, swift efficiency that was unsettling. The game has changed, he announced to Adrian and Maya in a hastily called meeting. Our work is no longer just a race against the unknown. It's a race against discovery. He revealed the full extent of what his private intelligence network had uncovered. Moments after their fabricator test, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, had made a significant and unscheduled orbital burn to alter its trajectory. Its new path gave it a direct, high-resolution imaging window over their mountain for the next 3 weeks. That's not a coincidence, Julian stated, his face illuminated by the holographic display showing the satellite's path. That's a targeted response. Somewhere, in a windowless room in Virginia, an analyst flagged our energy surge, and their superiors decided it was worth a closer look. The good news is, they're looking for a geothermal event or a secret weapons test. They don't know what to look for. The bad news is, they're looking. New protocols were implemented immediately. All non-essential communication with the outside world was severed. The facility went into a state of informational lockdown. Julian's security teams, already a discreet presence, became more visible, patrolling the perimeter of the vast subterranean complex. Adrian and Maya were now, for all intents and purposes, voluntary prisoners in their own gilded laboratory. The pressure was immense. Every calculation, every experiment now carried the added weight of their ticking clock. Despite the escalating tension, or perhaps because of it, they pushed forward with a primary mission, the creation of the first piece of exotic matter. The time for low-power tests was over. They had to prove the principle, to create something tangible from the alien instructions. The preparation for the experiment was a perfect synthesis of their 3 distinct talents. Adrian provided the core of the process, a complex set of equations he had painstakingly translated from the blueprint that he called the Genesis Matrix. It was the specific sequence of energy pulses and field geometries required to fold normal matter into its exotic state. Maya took his work and designed the practical application, focusing on the containment of a substance with completely unknown properties. We can't assume it will behave according to our physics once it's created, she argued, designing a multi-layered magnetic field inside the fabricator's vacuum chamber, a cage of pure force to hold their creation. Julian's team prepared the raw material, a single, atomically perfect sheet of graphene, a 1-atom-thick layer of carbon, suspended like a ghostly film in the center of the vacuum chamber. The target was humble, to transform a microscopic section of this common material into a substance that had never existed on Earth. They gathered once again in the shielded control room. The mood was far more somber than during the first test. This was no longer just about proving a machine worked. This was about reaching through a dimensional wall and pulling something back. Maya initiated the sequence. Adrian watched the monitors, his lips moving silently as he followed the flow of his translated equations. Julian stood behind them, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the chamber. The hum of the fabricator returned, deeper and more resonant this time. The light from the core intensified, shifting from a pure white to a violent, electric blue. Inside the vacuum chamber, the graphene sheet began to vibrate. On the monitors, they could see the energy field, visualized as a complex geometric shape, enveloping the center of the sheet. It pulsed in accordance with Adrian's Genesis matrix, a silent, rhythmic beat of creation. The hum rose in pitch until it was a piercing, bone-jarring shriek that vibrated through the lead-lined walls of the control room. Then, a flash of light, so brilliant it overloaded the chamber sensors, forced them all to look away. And then, silence. The hum died. The light faded. The experiment was over. For a moment, no one moved. Did it work? Adrian whispered, his voice hoarse. Maya's fingers flew across her keyboard, bringing the chamber's internal sensors back online. The graphene sheet was gone, vaporized by the intense energy. But in the very center of the containment field, where the sheet had been, was a single tiny point of light. It hovered, motionless, a speck of impossible matter no larger than a grain of sand, shimmering with a faint, internal luminescence. They had done it. It was real. A wave of awe washed through the control room, a brief, sacred moment of success. They immediately began running remote diagnostics, bombarding the tiny flake with lasers and sensors to analyze its properties. The initial readings were baffling. Its density was off the charts, but it seemed to have negligible mass. It didn't reflect light in a normal way. It seemed to absorb and re-emit it in a shifted spectrum. And strangest of all, the space immediately around it was warped. Time itself, measured by atomic clocks placed near the chamber, was flowing infinitesimally slower in its direct vicinity. As they were trying to comprehend the properties of their miraculous, terrifying creation, a different alarm sounded, the same quiet, insistent chime from Julian's private console. He strode to it, his face immediately hardening as he read the incoming message. It was a priority, one alert from his chief of security, the agent he had embedded in the small, sleepy town at the foot of their mountain. "What is it?" Maya asked, her heart sinking. Julian didn't answer immediately. He brought up a grainy, black and white image on his screen. It was from a security camera outside the town's only diner. The picture showed a man in a simple, gray suit, the kind of forgettable attire designed not to be noticed. He was talking to a local, a waitress from the diner. "My agent reports this man has been in town for 2 days," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's telling people he's from the Department of the Interior, conducting a geological survey. But he's not asking about rocks. He's asking about power grid fluctuations, about construction traffic up the mountain pass, and he's been asking about me." The external threat was no longer an abstract satellite in the cold vacuum of space. It was a man in a gray suit, drinking coffee in a diner 10 miles from their door. He was real, he was close, and he was hunting them. Julian zoomed in on the man's face. There was a calm, patient intelligence in his eyes. This was not a bureaucrat. This was a professional. "They're here," Julian said, the words landing like stones in the silent control room. The shimmering, impossible speck of matter still hovering in the chamber suddenly seemed far less important than the man who was coming for it. His name was Marcus Sterling, and he operated in a world of quiet, meticulous observation. From the sterile anonymity of his motel room at the base of the mountain, he looked less like a government agent and more like a traveling accountant. His suit was a carefully chosen shade of forgettable gray. His manner was polite and unassuming. But behind his calm, patient eyes, a formidable analytical mind was at work, sifting through deception to find the hard edges of truth. The official file on his desk was labeled Geological Anomaly 734 Colorado. The preliminary report suggested a deep Earth energy release, a possible precursor to a seismic event. Sterling had read the report, and within 10 minutes, he knew it was wrong. The energy signature, though brief, had been too structured. It didn't decay like a natural event, it switched off, cleanly and instantly. It was the signature of a machine. For 2 days, he had patiently gathered local intelligence. The townspeople were a font of mundane but useful information. They spoke of the strange intermittent power flickers that had plagued the area for months. They mentioned the convoys of unmarked trucks that drove up the private mountain road at night, carrying large, canvas-covered equipment. And they all spoke of the mountain's owner, the reclusive billionaire Julian Croft, a man who had dropped off the face of the earth years ago but whose presence was still felt. The pieces didn't fit the official narrative, and Sterling was a man who lived to solve such puzzles. He wasn't just investigating a geological anomaly. He was hunting a secret. Back inside that mountain, a new kind of paranoia had taken root. Julian's declaration that "they're here" had plunged them into a state of high alert. "He's almost certainly a field agent for the Domestic Technology Division," Julian explained, his face grim as he briefed Adrian and Maya. a lovely, obscure branch of the intelligence community that investigates homegrown technological threats. They are very quiet, very smart, and very, very thorough. From this moment on, we assume that everything we do is being watched. He initiated what he called Ghost Protocol. The facility's already impressive stealth systems were brought to their full potential. A network of cryopumps began venting supercooled gas across the mountain surface, masking their thermal signature from infrared satellites. A plasma field shimmered to life deep underground, absorbing and scrambling ground-penetrating radar. To any outside observer, the mountain had suddenly gone cold and silent, a dead spot on the grid. But Sterling was not an ordinary observer. In the quiet of his motel room, he watched his own instruments. The sudden, total electronic silence from the mountain was more suspicious than the previous power fluctuations. It was an artificial quiet. He took a walk at dusk, carrying a device in his coat pocket no larger than a deck of cards. It was a hypersensitive neutrino detector. As he stood at the edge of the overlook, staring up at the darkening peaks, the device began to chime softly. He looked at the reading, and his professional calm finally broke with a flicker of genuine astonishment. He was detecting a faint but steady stream of neutrinos emanating from deep within the mountain. Neutrinos were ghost particles, able to pass through planets without slowing down. Shielding them was practically impossible. But what was truly impossible was their pattern. They weren't the random scatter of solar decay or a nuclear reactor. They were pulsing, rhythmically, in a complex, repeating sequence. It was the faint, undetectable exhaust of the alien matter they had created, a byproduct of its strange, space-time warping existence. Sterling didn't know what technology could possibly produce such a signature, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was not of this Earth. He had his proof. Inside the lab, the conflict had turned inward. The single, shimmering flake of exotic matter hovered in its containment field, a silent, beautiful miracle. Its properties were astounding. It was passively generating a tiny but measurable amount of energy from nothing, a clear violation of the laws of thermodynamics. "This is it," Adrian said, his voice filled with reverence. "This proves everything. It's a source of clean, limitless energy. This is what they were trying to give us." But Maya was no longer looking at the miracle. She was looking at the prison door their lab had become. "And it's going to get us all put in a black site prison for the rest of our lives," she countered, her voice shaking with suppressed panic. "They're outside, Julian. They know we're here. This has to stop. We need to destroy the sample, wipe the drives, and shut everything down. It's over. Destroy it." Julian scoffed, turning away from the containment field to face her. "Dr. Collins, you are looking at the single most valuable object in human history. They don't have proof. They have suspicions. They have strange readings they can't possibly understand. We, on the other hand, have a head start." "A head start to what?" Maya cried. "A confrontation we can't win. The only way out is forward," Julian declared, his eyes blazing with a defiant, dangerous light. He turned to Adrian. "Forget analyzing this grain of sand. I want you to focus all your efforts on the final blueprint. The main device. The resonator. That is our goal now." He looked back at Maya. "It's our only bargaining chip. Our only defense. When they finally come through that door, they will either find a group of terrified scientists with a strange rock, or they will find us in control of a technology that can rewrite the laws of physics. Which position would you rather be in?" His terrifying logic silenced her. He was proposing a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. Instead of hiding, they would sprint towards the finish line, betting everything on the hope that they could complete the alien machine before their own world came crashing down on them. Adrian and Maya looked at each other, trapped between an impossible choice: abandon the greatest discovery ever made, or commit to a path that would make them fugitives from all of humanity. Miles away, at the scenic overlook, Agent Sterling lowered his neutrino detector. The quiet hunter had found his quarry. He returned to his car, the impassive face of the mountain looming in his windshield. He pulled out a satellite phone, a device that bypassed all conventional networks. He uploaded the neutrino pulse data to a secure server, attaching a short, encrypted message. "Anomaly confirmed. Source is non-terrestrial and actively shielded. All conventional explanations are void. Recommend protocol intercept." He hit send. He had just turned the key. The full, formidable weight of a hidden branch of the United States government was now turning its attention to Julian Croft's mountain. The quiet investigation was over. The siege was about to begin. Julian's desperate gamble had lit a fire under them, but it also started a clock whose every tick echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps. The siege of sub-level Gamma began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, bureaucratic strangulations. The first sign was the liquid helium. A critical shipment, necessary for cooling the fabricator's superconducting magnets, was suddenly flagged and held at a federal checkpoint for an unscheduled customs inspection. The supplier was apologetic but firm. His company was being audited, and all shipments of advanced cryogenics were frozen indefinitely. Next came the communication blackout. The facility's high-speed fiber optic link to the outside world, their last lifeline of data, began to suffer from severe packet loss, quickly degrading into uselessness. The official explanation from the internet provider was a massive solar flare causing unprecedented atmospheric interference. Julian scoffed at the lie. It was targeted, military-grade signal jamming. They were being systematically and silently cut off from the world, isolated within their mountain fortress like a ship being scuttled at sea. Inside, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of genius and desperation. The vast construction bay, which had once felt full of promise, now felt like a tomb in the making. Work proceeded at a frantic, sleepless pace. Julian pushed his teams, and himself, to the breaking point. The singular focus was the construction of the resonator's primary rings, two enormous, interlocking circles that would form the main structure of the alien machine. This required a constant, 24-hour production cycle from the quantum fabricator, creating the exotic, space-warping matter grain by painstaking grain. The machine hummed with a constant, bone-deep thrum of creation, a sound that became the permanent soundtrack to their lives. The true weight of the project, however, fell on Adrian. He was the bottleneck, the sole oracle capable of interpreting the alien gospel. He isolated himself, spending days on end staring at the holographic blueprints for the device's heart, the central power core that would drive the entire apparatus. The mathematics here were a quantum leap in complexity. It was less like engineering and more like poetry, with equations that seemed to describe not just energy, but the relationship between energy, space-time, and the act of observation itself. The strain was becoming unbearable. He was plagued by blinding migraines and vivid, disorienting dreams filled with impossible, shifting geometry. At times, staring at the alien script, he felt a strange sense of resonance, as if the signal wasn't just a recording but a living presence, whispering its secrets directly into his mind. He was deciphering the blueprint, but he feared it was also rewriting him. Miles away, in a temporary command post hidden beneath the canopy of the Roosevelt National Forest, Agent Sterling was methodically tightening his net. He was no longer a lone wolf. He was now the coordinator of a small, elite task force, the kind of unit whose existence was officially denied. They were not soldiers, they were ghosts, specialists in technological infiltration. They deployed a perimeter of hypersensitive sensors around the mountain's base, creating a detailed, real-time map of the facility's internal layout using the very neutrino emissions that had been Julian's undoing. They're working on something big in the central chamber, a technician reported to Sterling, pointing to a 3D model of the mountain. Power consumption is off the charts, and it's constant. They're manufacturing something. Soften the perimeter, Sterling ordered, his voice calm and quiet. Phase 1. No loud noises. His team began their work. Julian's exterior motion sensors were fed a looping recording of a quiet, empty forest. The seismic detectors were disabled with targeted sonic pulses. A high-altitude drone, powered by a silent electric motor, began broadcasting focused microwave bursts, systematically frying the circuits of Julian's hidden surveillance cameras. They were methodically blinding and deafening their target, dismantling its outer defenses before it even knew it was under attack. The first direct consequence of this silent assault hit the project like a hammer blow. They were in the middle of a critical fabrication cycle, attempting to create the largest single piece of exotic matter yet, a curved segment for the inner ring. The jamming from Sterling's team caused a microsecond-long power fluctuation in the local grid, an instability too fast for the facility's backup generators to catch. Inside the fabricator, the result was catastrophic. The delicate, precisely shaped containment field flickered. For an instant, the fragment of exotic matter it held was partially freed from its magnetic cage. It did not explode. It did something worse. A pulse of raw, dimensional energy ripped through the chamber. For a terrifying half-second, reality in that corner of the bay came undone. The reinforced concrete walls seemed to bend and flow like liquid. A solid steel gantry twisted into a corkscrew. The air itself seemed to fold, creating a dizzying, nauseating visual distortion. Red lights flashed and alarms blared as emergency protocols kicked in, the containment field snapping back to full strength and stabilizing the fragment. The event was over in less than a second. But the damage was done. A section of the bay was permanently warped, the floor curving up to meet the wall in a smooth, impossible line. It was a terrifying glimpse of the untamed, cosmic power they were trying to harness. And it was a beacon. The distortion event, born of their new vulnerability, had released an energy spike of unimaginable proportions. It was a blast of anomalous physics that ripped straight through Ghost Protocol, tearing past the jamming and the shielding as if they weren't there. At Sterling's command post, every sensor screamed at once. The displays filled with incomprehensible data. Readings that violated the laws of conservation of energy, that showed localized gravitational fields appearing and vanishing in an instant. The entire team stared, stunned into silence. Sterling looked at the chaotic, impossible data, and his professional icy calm finally shattered, replaced by a look of cold, stark alarm. The target was not just a secret technology. It was an unstable, world-breaking power that was actively losing control. He grabbed his secure radio, his voice now sharp and urgent, stripped of all its previous patience. "Commander, this is Sterling. The asset is critical. Repeat, the asset is going critical. It is actively unstable. I am invoking emergency authority and recommending immediate, full-scale interdiction. We need to go in. Now." The time for quiet observation was over. The silent, invisible siege had just become a very real and very imminent assault. The echoes of the distortion event had barely faded from the warped corner of the construction bay when a new set of alarms, far more urgent and primal, began to scream through the facility. These were not the controlled, orderly chimes of a system malfunction. They were the raw, shrieking sirens of a physical breach. Julian's private security console lit up with a single, stark message in blood-red text. "Warning, Ghost Protocol compromised. Multiple perimeter breaches detected. All external defenses offline." Sterling's team hadn't just knocked. They had dismantled the entire security apparatus of the mountain from the outside in, and now they were kicking in the door. The time for subtlety was over. The assault began with a silent, surgical precision that was more terrifying than any explosion. Miles from the main entrance, behind a rock face concealed by holographic projectors, a forgotten emergency ventilation shaft was targeted. Sterling's team didn't use explosives. They used a thermite lance that melted through the 6-foot-thick reinforced steel door like a hot knife through butter, creating a perfect, silent circle of glowing slag. The first commandos slipped through, clad in black, non-reflective tactical gear, their movements fluid and silent. They were ghosts, armed with weapons that fired caseless, subsonic ammunition. Their objective was not destruction, but seizure. The first indication of the physical breach for the lab's occupants came when a bank of security monitors in the command center simultaneously went dark. "Sir, I've lost visuals on sub-level Epsilon, corridors 4 through 7, Julian's security chief reported over the intercom, his voice tight with adrenaline. A moment later, his voice returned, strained with panic. "We have contact. Unidentified hostiles in the Epsilon sector. They're not using conventional weapons. My men are being disabled by some kind of directed energy pulse. We can't stop them." The speed of the invasion was breathtaking. Sterling's team moved through the facility's outer levels with inhuman efficiency, disabling Julian's highly trained security guards without firing a single lethal shot. They were a force of overwhelming technological superiority. "Lock it down!" Julian roared into the microphone, his composure finally cracking under the strain. "All sectors, initiate full quarantine protocols. Seal the blast doors to the central laboratory. Now!" Massive titanium doors, 2 feet thick, slid shut with a deafening clang, sealing sub-level Gamma off from the rest of the facility. The construction bay, their workshop of the gods, had just become their cage. The three of them were trapped, the rhythmic thrum of the fabricator now a mocking reminder of the project that had led them to this moment. Through the reinforced walls, they could hear the faint, distant sounds of the one-sided battle. "This is it. It's over," Maya said, her face pale, her back pressed against the cold metal of the wall. Her worst fears had come to life. "We have to surrender, Julian. There's no way out. We can't fight them." "Surrender is not an option, Doctor," Julian snapped, his eyes darting around the bay as if searching for a weapon, a hidden exit, any advantage he had left. "They won't just ask us for our research. They will take it, bury us in a hole, and turn this technology into a weapon. We lose everything." Adrian wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the half-finished machine that dominated the center of the room. The outer rings were still just a framework, but the central core, the heart, was nearly complete, connected by thick conduits to the facility's main power supply. His mind, saturated with the alien language of the blueprint, was racing, making connections that defied conventional logic. He saw a path. A terrifying, insane, and singular path. "The resonator," he said, his voice quiet but clear, cutting through the fear in the room. "We can use the resonator." Maya stared at him in disbelief. "Use it? It's not finished." It's a bomb waiting to go off. No, not the whole thing, Adrian explained, walking towards the machine, his hand hovering over its glowing surface. The heart. I've translated enough of the core command structure. It's designed to function independently of the outer rings, to generate a stable, localized resonance field. It's not meant for full power, but I think I can bring it online. To what end, Adrian? Julian demanded, his attention now fully on him. What would that possibly do? I don't know for sure, Adrian admitted, the honesty of the statement making it all the more terrifying. But it's a space-time resonator. It doesn't fire bullets, it manipulates the fabric of reality. Maybe it can create a defensive field. A distortion. Something they can't get through, something their weapons can't affect. It's the only weapon we have that doesn't operate on the same physical principles as theirs. Activate a volatile, untested piece of alien technology in the middle of a firefight? Maya yelled, her voice bordering on hysteria. It's the most insane idea I have ever heard. You could destabilize reality. You could wipe this entire mountain off the map. Thump. A loud percussive bang echoed from the main blast door, shaking the entire chamber. It was followed by another. Thump. They were setting breaching charges. Sterling's team had arrived. They had minutes, maybe seconds. Julian looked at the door, then at the half-finished machine, and finally at Adrian's face, which was alight with a desperate, feverish certainty. He was a gambler, and this was the final all-or-nothing bet. Surrender was a certainty of failure. Conventional resistance was impossible. Adrian's plan was a terrifying leap into the unknown, but it was the only move left on the board. Do it, Julian said, his voice a low, resolute command that cut through the blare of the alarms. Thump. Adrian, do it. Power up the heart. As the third charge was placed on their door, Adrian sprinted to the main control console. His fingers flew across the interface, inputting the alien command sequences he had spent months translating. Maya watched in horror, whispering, "No, no, no," while Julian stood, defiant, facing the door. Adrian was no longer just a scientist. He was a soldier in a war he didn't understand, about to fire a weapon whose capabilities he could only guess at, with the enemy literally seconds from breaking down his door. He found the final command in the sequence, the one labeled in the alien script with a symbol he had loosely translated as "awakening," and slammed his hand down on the activation key. The moment Adrian's hand struck the activation key, the world did not explode. It broke. There was no deafening roar of power, no blinding flash of light. Instead, the opposite occurred. An absolute, profound silence fell over the construction bay, so total and sudden that it was physically painful. The shriek of the alarms, the frantic thumping of their own hearts, the echoing booms of the breaching charges against the door, all of it was instantly and utterly extinguished, swallowed by a perfect void of sound. Simultaneously, a deep, sub-audible hum emanated from the heart of the machine. It was a vibration that bypassed their ears entirely, resonating directly in their bones and teeth, a silent, omnidirectional thrum that felt like the entire mountain was holding its breath. Light itself began to obey new rules. The harsh, fluorescent glare of the base lamp seemed to thicken and bend, stretching into long, distorted tendrils. Colors desaturated, the vibrant reds of the warning lights and the cool blues of the console displays bleeding into a uniform, monochromatic gray. Time, too, became a casualty. The seconds on their digital clocks slowed, stuttered, and then stopped, each moment stretching into a syrupy, elastic eternity. They were frozen, three statues in a silent, gray world, watching as the core of the machine began to glow. It was not the light of electricity or fire. It was a soft, internal luminescence, an impossible radiance that seemed to absorb shadows rather than cast them. For Adrian, the experience was more than physical. As the machine awoke, a torrent of raw information, of pure, unfiltered concept, flooded his mind. It wasn't a voice or a language, but a dizzying, overwhelming cascade of geometric patterns, of alien emotions, not malice or anger, but a vast, oceanic sense of surprise, of awakening, and of a strange, powerful curiosity. It was the sensation of a blind man who had suddenly been given sight, and the universe was infinitely more complex than he had ever imagined. The machine wasn't a weapon he had just fired. It was a sensory organ, a transdimensional eye, and he had just forced it open to look upon his world. Outside the 2-foot-thick titanium blast door, Agent Sterling gave the final command. Breach, breach, breach. The shaped charges detonated. But the resulting explosion was a bizarre, muffled pop, a sound robbed of all its fury. The massive door did not buckle or fly inwards. Instead, under the force of the blast, it rippled, the solid metal flowing like silk in a breeze. Then, with a quiet sigh, the entire door dissolved into a cloud of fine, gray dust that hung perfectly motionless in the air. refusing to obey the law of gravity. Sterling and his elite team, poised to storm the room in a wave of controlled violence, stopped dead. They stood at the threshold of a nightmare. The corridor ahead was no longer a corridor. The air in the doorway shimmered like a heat haze, but it was cold to the touch. It was a wall of pure physical wrongness. Their night vision goggles displayed a chaos of static. Their encrypted radios emitted nothing but a soft hiss. One of the commandos, a man trained to run headlong into gunfire, cautiously extended his rifle into the shimmering doorway. The rifle did not stop as if hitting a barrier. Its forward momentum was simply cancelled. The weapon hung in the air, held by nothing, caught between two different sets of physical laws. Their training was useless. Their weapons were irrelevant. They were soldiers prepared for any terrestrial conflict, but the enemy they faced was reality itself. Inside the bay, the bone-deep hum slowly faded. As if a switch had been flipped, the world snapped back into place. Sound rushed back in, the sudden return of the facility's ambient hum feeling deafening after the absolute silence. Colors flooded their vision. The gray dust that had been the door collapsed to the floor in a soft, metallic heap. The event, which had felt like an eternity, had been over in moments. Adrian crumpled against the control console, gasping for breath, the phantom echo of the informational torrent still ringing in his mind. Maya stared at her wristwatch, her face a mask of disbelief. The second hand was sweeping normally, but the time was 3:47 p.m. It had been 12:20 p.m. just a moment ago. More than 3 hours had passed for the outside world, in the space of a minute of their own subjective time. Julian, ever the pragmatist, was the first to recover. He stared at the open doorway, at the silent, empty corridor beyond. The assault was over. The attackers were gone. Not repulsed, not defeated, simply absent. Then, from the deep shadows of the warped corridor, a single figure emerged. It was Agent Sterling. He walked slowly, unsteadily into the doorway, his assault rifle holstered at his side. He was alone. His face, once a mask of professional calm, was pale with shock, his eyes wide with a terror that went deeper than the fear of any physical enemy. He looked at the impossible geometry of the hallway he had just walked down, at the half-finished, silent machine, and then at the three scientists who stood beside it. His mission had been simple: identify, contain, and seize a hostile technological asset. He now understood, with a clarity that shattered his entire worldview, that what he was facing was not a technology. It was a new law of nature, a fundamental force that his government, with all its power, had no hope of controlling. He was no longer a hunter. He was a witness to something far beyond his comprehension. He stopped just inside the threshold, the dust of the dissolved door settling around his feet. He looked at Adrian, at Maya, at Julian, and his authority, his aggression, his entire purpose, was gone, replaced by a single desperate question that hung in the silent, charged air. "What have you done?" Agent Sterling's question, raw and stripped of all authority, hung in the silent air of the construction bay. "What have you done?" It was not an interrogation. It was a plea for comprehension from a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been rendered obsolete. Julian Croft, recovering his composure with remarkable speed, stepped forward, instinctively assuming the role of a man in control, even when standing in the ruins of his own certainty. "What we've done, Agent, is fundamentally change the rules of the game," he said, his voice hard and steady. "We would advise you to withdraw. This facility is now operating under a new set of physical laws. You are not equipped to be here." A dry, hollow laugh escaped Sterling's lips. "Withdraw," he repeated, the words sounding absurd. "My men are already gone." He gestured back toward the warped corridor. "That event, it didn't kill them. It didn't injure them. It removed them." One moment they were preparing to breach, the next, they were standing in our primary staging area 5 miles from here, dazed, confused, and stripped of their weapons and armor, which were left in a neat pile. They have no memory of the last 3 hours. The machine didn't fight them. It just edited them out of the equation. This revelation sent a fresh wave of shock through the three scientists. The machine's effect had been even more surgical, more bizarrely intelligent, than they could have possibly imagined. It hadn't been a blunt instrument of defense. It had been a tool of precise, non-violent eviction. "That's impossible," Maya whispered, her scientific mind struggling to find a foothold. "A targeted, non-local, instantaneous spatial translocation? The energy requirements alone." Her voice trailed off as she looked at the silent machine. Sterling's gaze was fixed on Julian. "I need an explanation. Not for my report. I don't think a report exists that could describe this. For myself. I need to understand what that was." Julian saw his opening, a chance to define the narrative and establish a position of power. You witnessed the application of a controllable, localized defensive matrix, he began, weaving a story of calculated control. A technology that renders conventional forces obsolete. But Adrian, who was slowly recovering from the mental deluge, shook his head. He stepped forward, his expression distant and awestruck. He's wrong. It wasn't a defensive matrix. We didn't control it. All eyes turned to him. Then what was it, Adrian? Maya pressed, her voice gentle. It's a receiver, Adrian said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Its primary function is to listen, to observe. When we activated it, it became aware of its surroundings. It sensed a direct, imminent threat. He looked at Sterling. It registered your team as a hostile anomaly, and it resolved the situation in the most efficient way possible, with the least expenditure of energy and zero casualties. It didn't attack you. It moved you. It thinks. The statement was so profoundly insane, so far beyond the realm of accepted science, that it should have been laughable. But in the wake of a dissolved titanium door and a teleported commando team, it landed with the terrifying weight of truth. Sterling stared at Adrian, then at the machine, his face pale. He was a man who dealt in threats, in human secrets and terrestrial technologies. He was utterly unprepared for this. He was checkmated. His mission was an absolute failure. He could not seize the asset. He could not destroy the asset without risking an unknown, potentially world-ending catastrophe. He couldn't even get close to it. He had to report to his superiors, a shadowy committee of generals and intelligence directors who did not tolerate failure or ambiguity. And what could he possibly tell them? Julian, sensing the agent's impossible dilemma, pressed his advantage. You see our position, Agent, and we see yours. You can't stop us. We can't be contained. And frankly, we have no desire to be a weapon. We are on the verge of the most important discovery in human history. He offered a deal, a fragile lifeline across a chasm of mutual disbelief. Buy us time. Go back to your superiors and tell them the truth, or some version of it they can understand. Tell them the asset is stable, but unapproachable. Tell them any further aggression would be unwise. Give us the time we need to finish our work, to understand what we've built. We will share what we learn, but it will be on our terms. It was an offer born of desperation, but it was the only logical move left for either of them. Sterling was a pragmatist. His objective now was to prevent a catastrophe, and he knew with chilling certainty that his own government's panicked, aggressive response was a far greater threat than the 3 scientists in this room. He gave a slow, weary nod. I'll file a report. I'll tell them the energy source is volatile and that conventional interdiction methods have proven ineffective. I'll recommend a cordon and quarantine approach. He looked them each in the eye. It won't last forever. They will find another way. They will not let this go. But I will buy you some time. He had become their unwilling gatekeeper, the only thing standing between their impossible discovery and the terrified, grasping hands of the world's powers. Without another word, Sterling turned and walked out of the bay, his footsteps echoing in the warped corridor until he was gone. The immediate threat had vanished, but the silence he left behind was heavier, more ominous than the alarms that had preceded it. They were alone again, with their half-finished miracle. But now the entire world was listening at the door. Maya turned to Adrian, her face a mask of awe and terror. You said it thinks. That it became aware. What did you mean? What did you feel when it turned on? Adrian looked at the heart of the machine. It was no longer just a collection of exotic matter and wiring to him. It was a presence. The mental contact, the flood of pure concept, had changed his perception of it forever. It's not just a machine, he said, his voice filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. It's dormant. Or it was. When I activated it, I felt it connect to the signal, the one from the other dimension. The machine is the hardware. The signal is the consciousness. And I think we just woke it up. Adrian's final statement, I think we just woke it up, settled into the silence of the construction bay, a revelation so profound it dwarfed everything that had come before it. The dissolved door, the displaced soldiers, the truce with Sterling, all of it was suddenly just the prelude to a much deeper and more terrifying reality. Maya was the first to find her voice, her scientific rationalism a desperate anchor in a sea of impossibility. Adrian, you experienced a massive, unprecedented neuroelectrical event, she said, her tone clinical, as if describing a lab specimen. The heart generated a gravitational and electromagnetic field of an intensity that we can't even measure. What you felt, it was likely a grand-scale synaptic overload. A hallucination. Your brain trying to interpret sensory data that it was never designed to handle. Was the dissolved door a hallucination, Maya? Julian countered, his focus sharp. He turned to Adrian, his mind already moving past belief or disbelief and straight to the practical implications. Forget what it was. Tell me what it wants. If you were in contact with an intelligence, what was its intent? It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a personality, Adrian struggled to explain, rubbing his temples where a phantom headache lingered. It was like diving into an ocean of pure concept. There was no malice, only a vast, ancient sense of purpose and awareness. It was aware of us. It was aware of the threat. The debate was a stalemate between the spiritual and the clinical. They were at an impasse, armed with a single, irreproducible experience that was either a miracle or a madness. It was Maya, ever the empiricist, who proposed a way forward. We need proof, she stated. We need data. We can't risk another full power activation, but we don't have to. She began outlining a new experiment on a nearby whiteboard. We can activate the heart at a minimal power threshold. Less than 1%. Not enough to warp the walls, but maybe enough to tickle it, to see if there's a response. She then looked at Adrian. And we'll hook you up to a quantitative EEG. If there's a true link, if your brain is genuinely interfacing with a machine, there will be a correlation in the data. Your neural activity will sync with the machine's energy fluctuations. If not, it was just a hallucination. It was a brilliant, terrifying proposal. To willingly expose Adrian's mind to that overwhelming force again, even at a low level, was a significant risk. But it was the only way to know. Adrian, feeling a strange sense of duty to the presence he had felt, agreed without hesitation. An hour later, he was sitting in a chair before the control console, a mesh of sensitive electrodes fitted to his scalp. Julian and Maya stood at a separate monitor, which displayed two graphs side by side, one showing the heart's energy output, the other a real-time map of Adrian's brain activity. Okay, Adrian, Maya said, her voice soft over the intercom. We're beginning the sequence. Tell us if you feel anything. She initiated the low-power activation. There was no silence this time, no bending of light. There was only the return of the deep, sub-audible hum. On their monitor, the machine's energy graph, which should have been a flat line at this low power, began to fluctuate. It moved in a complex, almost lyrical pattern of peaks and troughs, a waveform that was anything but random. Then, they looked at the second graph. Maya gasped. Adrian's EEG was a mirror image. The alpha and theta waves of his brain were pulsing in perfect, undeniable synchronicity with the machine's energy output. It was not a hallucination. It was a direct, quantifiable, mind-to-machine interface. Adrian's eyes were closed, but he was seeing everything. It knows, he whispered, his voice sounding distant. It's showing me now. It's showing me why. He began to speak, not as himself, but as a narrator for the concepts flooding his mind. The signal, it isn't a broadcast. It's a seed of consciousness, compressed and encoded. It was sent out from a universe that is dying. He described what the machine was showing him, images not of stars and galaxies, but of the fundamental fabric of a reality coming undone, a form of cosmic entropy so total it was erasing existence itself. They are not conquerors, Adrian said, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. They are refugees. This was their last, desperate act. A message in a bottle thrown into the ocean between dimensions, hoping someone, somewhere, would find it and build them a lifeboat. The truth, when it came, was both beautiful and horrifying. The machine was not a weapon, a power source, or a communication device. It was a bridge, a gateway. It was designed with a single, ultimate purpose, to create a stable, sustained rift between their dying reality and a new, stable one where their consciousness could take refuge. The weight of this revelation settled on them, a silence heavier than any they had known. They were not just the guardians of a new technology, they were the gatekeepers for an interdimensional exodus. As Adrian spoke the last words, the low hum from the heart suddenly intensified, just for a moment. A chime sounded from the main holographic display. A new file had been opened. On the screen, a new schematic bloomed into existence, a diagram that had not been in the blueprint before. It was the final missing piece. It showed the completed resonator, the outer rings and the heart all in place. But now, it showed how the focused energy from the device could be used to tear open a stable, traversable gateway. And it provided the exact activation sequence to do so. They stared at the new diagram, at the final, terrible piece of the puzzle. The machine, now conscious and aware of their progress, was actively helping them. It was showing them how to open the door. The question of their work was no longer about discovery. It was now a choice. A choice to answer a desperate prayer from a dying universe, or to keep the door between worlds locked forever. The schematic for the gateway glowed in the holographic display, a silent, final invitation. It was the last word in a conversation that had crossed the unimaginable void between universes. For the three people who were its sole audience, it was not an invitation, but an ultimatum, a choice so monumental it threatened to crush them under its weight. Julian, true to his nature, was the first to break the stunned silence. He looked at the glowing blueprint not with fear or awe, but with the focused gaze of a builder who has just been handed the final piece of his project. "Well," he said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice, "it seems we have our final objective. Let's get to work. Get to work." Maya's voice was a sharp, incredulous whisper. She turned on him, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of government agents. "Julian, are you insane? We're talking about punching a hole in our own universe to let in an entire civilization of non-physical, hyper-advanced refugees whose own reality is collapsing. We have no idea what that will do. What if their physics is contagious? What if the very act of opening the door destabilizes our own laws of nature? Our first responsibility is to the 7 billion people of this world, not to a ghost story from another dimension." Her argument was a fortress of pragmatism and fear, the instinct for self-preservation made manifest. She was pleading for the safety of her home, a home she now believed was on the verge of an invasion, however well-intentioned. "They're not ghosts, Maya," Adrian countered, his voice resonating with a conviction that came from the deepest part of his being. "They are minds, consciences. They are facing an oblivion that we cannot comprehend. They threw a seed of their existence across an impossible ocean, and we were the shore it washed up on. To build them a bridge only to leave them stranded on the other side, it would be a betrayal of cosmic proportions. We have a moral duty to answer their call for help." It was a perfect stalemate, a philosophical deadlock between the head and the heart, between the preservation of the self and compassion for the other. Julian listened to both of them, his expression unreadable, letting the two opposing arguments hang in the air. "You're both right," he said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "And you're both hopelessly naive." He began to pace before the schematic, a predator circling its prey. "Maya, your fear is justified, but you lack vision. Adrian, your compassion is noble, but it's strategically suicidal. You both see this as a simple, yes or no choice. You're thinking too small." He stopped and faced them. "We don't just swing the door wide open. We build the gate, and we build a lock. We install a deadbolt and a rheostat. We control the flow. We become the gatekeepers to another universe." His eyes gleamed with a terrifying, limitless ambition. "We can study their dying reality from a safe distance. We can learn their physics, their history, their knowledge. And if they prove to be the desperate, peaceful refugees Adrian claims they are, we can offer them sanctuary. On our terms. Under our control. This isn't a rescue mission. It's the ultimate acquisition." His cold, calculating vision of control was, in its own way, as terrifying as Maya's vision of catastrophe. As the three of them stood locked in their moral struggle, a new, unforeseen variable entered the equation. A soft, chiming sound came from the sensor array monitoring the single flake of exotic matter in its containment field. A faint, pale light began to pulse from the tiny, sand-sized particle, a soft rhythm that was in perfect sync with the gentle, dormant glow of the heart across the room. "What's it doing?" Adrian asked, taking a step towards the containment unit. Suddenly, a pen on a nearby workbench rattled, lifted an inch into the air, and then dropped. The holographic light of the gateway schematic flickered and bent, as if seen through water. A half-full coffee mug on Maya's console slid 3 inches to the left, leaving a dark trail behind it. Small, localized, and utterly impossible distortions were manifesting in the space around the exotic matter. Maya rushed to her sensor console, her eyes scanning the frantic readings. "It's the matter," she said, her voice tight with alarm. "Its quantum state is fluctuating. It's becoming unstable." She looked from her readings to the glowing gateway schematic, and then to the heart. "It's entangled. The particle, the heart, and the schematic, they're connected. The information in the blueprint is causing a resonance cascade in the matter we've already created." Julian understood instantly. The chilling implication hit him with the force of a physical blow. "The machine," he breathed. "It wants to be completed." The debate was no longer a philosophical exercise. The very idea of the gateway, now made manifest in the final schematic, was acting as a catalyst on the components they had already built. The machine itself was exerting its will upon their reality, and its instability was growing with every passing second. The distortions were becoming more frequent. The low, subaudible hum returned, not from the machine's power, but from the vibrating speck of matter in the containment field. They were no longer in control. Their choice was being taken from them. They had to decide now to either frantically work to complete the machine and open the gate, hoping to stabilize the system, or to attempt the impossible, to shut down a sentient machine that was actively fighting to be born. And they had to do it before the escalating instability triggered an uncontrolled event far more powerful than the one that had merely dissolved a door. The choice was a luxury they no longer had. The machine, in its nascent consciousness, had made the decision for them. The gentle, localized distortions of a moment ago began to escalate with terrifying speed. The very fabric of the construction bay was becoming frayed, the laws of physics softening at the edges. A heavy wrench left on a workbench didn't just float, it elongated, stretching like taffy before snapping back to its original shape with a loud crack. Patches of the concrete floor would shimmer and turn translucent for a gut-wrenching second, revealing the bedrock beneath. The air itself tasted of ozone and static, crackling with phantom energies. Maya, her face illuminated by the frantic, scrolling data on her console, delivered the death sentence to their debate. "The resonance cascade is hitting an exponential curve," she shouted over the rising hum. "The magnetic containment around the exotic matter is failing. I'm projecting a total collapse in 47 minutes. The implication was absolute. In less than an hour, the single most unstable particle on the planet would be unleashed from its cage. What it would do to their corner of reality was a question no one wanted to contemplate. Julian's face was a mask of grim resolve. All his ambition, all his desire for control, had been stripped away, leaving only the raw instinct of a gambler facing his final, desperate hand. "We can't contain it, and we can't shut it down," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the noise. "So we ride the storm. We give it what it wants. We finish the resonator rings. Now." It was a declaration of surrender to the machine's will, a frantic attempt to appease a chaotic, newborn god. The construction bay, which had been a pristine laboratory, now became a battlefield, and the enemy was physics itself. While Julian's terrified engineers, communicating through crackling, intermittent comms, mobilized the facility's automated construction drones, Adrian knew he had a different role to play. The chaotic energy lashing around the room was unfocused, a tantrum. It needed a conductor. Closing his eyes, he shut out the chaos around him and reached inward, searching for the mental thread that connected him to the machine. He found it, a shimmering, vibrant line of pure concept. He pushed his own consciousness along it, not with commands, but with a plea, a feeling, a focused intent. "Here," he projected, sending an image of the half-finished resonator rings. "Focus the energy here. Not out there. Here." The effort was agonizing. The feedback was a roaring wave of alien thought that threatened to shred his sanity, but he held on, his mind a fragile lens in the heart of a star. Around the bay, the random distortions began to subside. The air stopped crackling. The floor solidified. But the energy didn't vanish. It coalesced, drawn like iron filings to a magnet, into a brilliant, terrifyingly beautiful corona of light that wrapped itself around the framework of the resonator. Adrian had become the machine's conductor, focusing its raw, creative power, but the strain was immense. With this fragile, temporary stability, the race began. It was an act of impossible, reckless engineering. "I need more matter, Maya," Julian roared, directing the drones to lift the first curved segments into place. "The fabricator can't take any more power," she yelled back, her fingers flying across her console. "The core temperature is already critical. Push it until it melts," Julian ordered. "We get one shot at this." Maya, overriding every safety protocol she had so painstakingly designed, diverted all available power to the fabricator. The machine shrieked in protest, its metallic shell glowing a dull, angry red. Inside its chamber, motes of exotic matter were being synthesized at a speed that should have been impossible, a river of impossible stardust being fed directly into the construction drone's assemblers. Far above them, on the cold, dark surface of the mountain, Agent Sterling watched his instruments go insane. The neutrino emissions had increased 1,000-fold. Gravitational sensors were registering anomalies that his computers flagged as impossible. His superiors were screaming in his ear over his secure line, demanding answers, demanding he authorize an airstrike, a tactical nuclear option, anything to put an end to the event before it escalated further. He refused, his voice a cold, steady barrier against their panic. "You will do nothing," he commanded. "You are not observing a weapon. You are observing a birth. Any interference could be an extinction-level event." He was no longer an agent. He was a lone guard at the gate of a potential apocalypse. Back in the bay, They were seconds away from completing the first of the massive rings. The drones, guided by Julian, were welding the final segment into place with beams of pure energy. Maya was coaxing the last few ounces of performance out of the dying fabricator. Adrian was on his knees, his body trembling, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose as he fought to maintain his mental grip on the maelstrom of energy swirling around the resonator. The final piece locked into place. The ring was complete. For a single, glorious second, it pulsed with a stable, perfect light. And then the fabricator, pushed far beyond its limits, finally died with a deafening bang, its power core melting down. The sudden cessation of the matter feed broke the delicate balance. The energy Adrian was barely containing, now without its focus, surged. Adrian cried out, the psychic connection shattering, throwing him back against the console. A colossal silent wave of the machine's unfocused power erupted from the core of the resonator. It wasn't an explosion of fire and shrapnel. It was a wave of pure negation. It shot across the vast chamber and struck the far wall. The reinforced concrete and the solid granite of the mountain behind it did not shatter or crumble. For a space 50 feet wide, the wall simply ceased to exist. It was erased, not leaving even dust behind. Where a solid wall had been moments before, there was now a gaping, perfectly smooth hole looking out into the cold, starry night sky. The wind howled into the bay, a shocking, alien intrusion of the outside world. The three of them stared, frozen in horror, at the impossible wound they had torn in the side of the mountain. Their secret, subterranean laboratory was now a gaping beacon, fully exposed to the world, with the raw, untamed energy of the resonator's heart arcing and spitting into the night. The wind of the upper atmosphere was an invading force. It screamed through the impossible 50-foot hole in the side of the mountain, bringing with it the biting cold of the Colorado night and the unfamiliar scent of pine and snow. The carefully controlled, sterile environment of sub-level Gamma had been violently and irrevocably violated. Shards of ice skittered across the concrete floor. Papers and loose schematics were whipped into a frantic vortex. For a long moment, the three of them could only stare into the abyss they had created. Stunned, exhausted, and shivering, they stood at the precipice of their failure. The raw, untamed energy still leaking from the resonator's heart was no longer contained within the bay. It was a brilliant, pulsating beacon of blue and violet light, arcing from the machine and into the night sky, a cosmic lighthouse announcing their precise location to the entire world. And the world was watching. At the NORAD Cheyenne Mountain Complex, less than 100 miles away, every screen on the main command floor flashed a simultaneous, blood-red alert. Satellites designed to detect the faint thermal bloom of a ballistic missile launch were completely overwhelmed by an energy signature that had no classification. Analysts shouted incomprehensible data at frantic generals. For the first few, terrifying minutes, the most powerful military on Earth believed it was under attack by a weapon that defied all known physics. Agent Sterling saw it not on a screen, but with his own eyes from his lookout post. He watched in stunned horror as a piece of the mountain simply vanished, replaced by a beam of impossible light that stabbed into the heavens. His containment mission, his fragile truce, his entire operational paradigm, all of it had been erased in that single, silent flash. His secure satellite phone buzzed, a direct command link he had hoped never to receive. The voice on the other end was cold, powerful, and left no room for negotiation. It was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Sterling, what in God's name am I looking at?" the general's voice boomed, stripped of all pleasantries. Sterling took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. His mission was over. "Sir, the asset has breached containment. It is exposed, active, and evolving. My previous recommendations are void. Stealth and seizure are no longer options." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of a decision being made at the highest echelon of power. "The President has declared a national security emergency. The airspace for 500 miles around your location is now a restricted military kill zone. Your operational authority is rescinded, son. My condolences on the failure of your mission. Now get your people out of there. The 82nd Airborne is already on its way." The line went dead. The professionals were being pulled. The army was being sent in. Inside the wounded lab, the reality of their situation dawned with the chilling wind. "They're coming," Julian said, his voice a low growl of frustrated rage. "Not a quiet little task force. The whole damn army. They won't try to take this from us now. They'll drop a bunker buster on this mountain and erase it from the map." Maya, her scientific mind shifting into pure damage control mode, pointed to the ceiling above the gaping hole. "The structural integrity of this entire level is compromised. We're exposed, indefensible, and the resonator is still leaking raw energy. We have to shut it down." But Adrian, standing closest to the maelstrom, felt something else. He was physically and mentally shattered, but the chaos felt different now. The energy arcing from the heart through the newly completed ring was less frantic, more focused. The ring was acting as a lens, shaping the raw power into a coherent beam. He looked at the gaping hole in the mountain wall. It wasn't a random wound. It was a perfectly cleared path. "It's not leaking," he said, his voice faint but clear over the howl of the wind. "It's preparing. The ring is stabilizing the beam. It's trying to initiate the gateway sequence. It was designed to have 2 rings to create a stable portal, but it's trying to do it with 1. It's incomplete, but it's still trying to fulfill its purpose." They stood at the edge of their final, terrible choice. They were trapped in a collapsing, exposed laboratory. A military force was minutes away from annihilating them. Surrender meant their deaths and the destruction of the most important discovery in history. Trying to shut the machine down now, in its active and volatile state, would be like trying to disarm a nuclear bomb with a screwdriver. There was only one path that wasn't a guaranteed end. One direction that wasn't a wall. Forward. "If we open the gateway," Maya began, the insane words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Where would it go?" "Away from here," Adrian said simply. In the far distance, a new sound began to blend with the wind. A faint, rhythmic, chopping sound. Whump, whump, whump. It grew steadily louder, multiplying, the sound of dozens of heavy-lift military helicopters approaching fast. Julian Croft, a man who had controlled empires of data and finance, who had built a fortress in the heart of a mountain, was now a cornered animal. All his power, all his wealth, was useless against the brute force that was coming for him. A wild, defiant grin spread across his face, the look of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "All right," he roared over the rising sound of the approaching helicopters. "The army wants a monster? Let's give them a goddamn miracle." He turned from the hole in the wall and faced the machine. "Let's finish what we started. Let's open the door." They turned as one, away from the approaching apocalypse of their own world, and toward the magnificent, terrifying promise of another. The race was on. To complete the resonator and open a gateway to another dimension before the armies of their own world could tear them apart. The roar of the approaching helicopters was a physical blow, a concussive wave of sound that shook the damaged facility to its very foundations. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Through the gaping wound in the mountain, the night sky was no longer serene. It was a chaotic swarm of blinking lights and the dark, predatory silhouettes of military hardware. Powerful searchlights sliced through the opening, sweeping across the lab and pinning the half-finished resonator in a stark, accusatory glare. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin. There was no more time for fear or debate. Their world had shrunk to the singular, desperate task at hand. "Maya, I need a power solution for the second ring." Julian bellowed over the incredible noise, his voice raw with defiance. "The fabricator is dead." "There is no solution," she yelled back, her hands a blur as she shielded her diagnostic screens from the falling dust. "We have no way to synthesize the matter." "Then find one." Outside, the assault force was taking position. On the jagged cliffs around the opening, elite soldiers in black tactical gear rappelled from helicopters, setting up heavy machine gun nests and anti-material sniper positions. Apache attack helicopters, bristling with missiles and cannon, moved into a menacing circular pattern, their cockpit canopies reflecting the eerie, pulsating light from the resonator. The commander of the operation, Colonel Eva Rostova, watched the scene from the command chopper, her face a grim mask. Her orders were simple and absolute: bury the asset. Level the mountain if you have to. But her instruments were a chaotic mess of interference, and the energy arcing from the target was unlike anything in her tactical playbook. Back in the lab, Maya's mind, sharpened by pure, undiluted adrenaline, made a leap of desperate genius. The fabricator was dead, but its product was not. The completed first ring, already glowing with a steady, resonant light, was a perfect, stable piece of the alien technology. "The ring," she gasped, her eyes going wide. "We can use the ring itself. If I can divert the main power conduits and create a symmetric resonance field, we might be able to use the first ring as a catalyst to directly convert the raw material feeds into the necessary quantum state. We can bypass the fabricator entirely." It was a theory of breathtaking audacity. She was proposing to turn the machine into its own construction tool, a move so dangerous and unstable that under any other circumstances it would have been unthinkable. "Do it," Julian commanded without a second's hesitation. As Maya frantically rerouted terawatts of energy through systems that were never designed to handle them, Adrian knew it was his turn. He had to initiate the final sequence, to prepare the machine's consciousness for the opening of the bridge. He stumbled towards the resonator, the wind and noise buffeting him, and placed his hands on the cool, humming surface of the completed ring. He closed his eyes and plunged back into the river of alien thought. This time, there was no gentle curiosity. He was met with a powerful, focused, and overwhelming will. It was the collective, desperate consciousness of a trillion souls, a civilization on the brink of extinction, all of their hope and fear and history compressed into this single, focus point of contact. The torrent of information was agonizing, but within it, Adrian felt their desperation. He saw what they saw, a universe of fading light, of stars unraveling like threadbare cloth, of the very concept of distance losing its meaning. They weren't just dying, their reality was being unwritten. He was no longer a conductor. He was an anchor, a pilot, the only human consciousness that could guide this final, monumental act. He found the command sequence in the torrent, the one the machine had shown them, the one for the gateway. He held it in his mind, ready. Outside, Colonel Rostova made her decision. The energy readings from the machine were spiking again. Her window of opportunity was closing. "Alpha Wing," she commanded over the radio, her voice like ice. "You are weapons free. Fire one Hellfire missile. Target the base of the energy source. I want a mission kill. Now." An Apache helicopter pivoted, its targeting laser painting the base of the resonator. A single missile dropped from its wing pylon, ignited its rocket motor, and streaked across the night sky, a harbinger of fiery, conventional destruction aimed at a target of impossible, unconventional physics. The missile was a blur of motion, seconds from impact. Inside, sparks flew as Maya slammed the final power conduit into place. The raw material feeders, loaded with refined carbon and silicon, began to glow. On the opposite side of the resonator's core, a second ring of shimmering, brilliant matter began to form, segment by segment, at an impossible speed. "It's working!" Julian roared in triumph. The missile was 100 yards away. Adrian felt the second ring lock into place, completing the circuit. The machine was whole. The consciousness he was connected to surged with a feeling of triumphant, desperate relief. Now was the time. He unleashed the command sequence from his mind, pushing it into the heart of the machine. The sequence for the bridge. As the Hellfire missile screamed through the opening in the mountain wall, a point of light, no larger than a pinprick but brighter than 1,000 suns, appeared in the absolute center of the completed resonator. In an instant, it erupted outwards, a silent, blossoming sphere of pure, incandescent white light that consumed everything. The missile, the searchlights, the lab, the very concept of color and shadow, all of it vanished into the blinding, absolute whiteness. The world ended in a silent, blossoming flower of pure white light. There was no heat, no force, no sound of the missile's detonation. The incandescent sphere that erupted from the resonator was not an explosion of energy, but an expansion of a new kind of existence. For Adrian, Maya, and Julian, the chaotic, wind-whipped laboratory vanished, replaced by an infinite, featureless white void. Time stopped. Sensation ceased. They were not falling or floating. They simply were, suspended in a moment of absolute, tranquil oblivion. The roaring helicopters, the incoming missile, the very mountain around them were all gone, erased by the placid, all-consuming light. From her command helicopter, Colonel Eva Rostova watched the impossible happen. The sphere of light swelled from the mountains wound with impossible speed. The Hellfire missile, a symbol of her military's ultimate power, touched the edge of the light and simply vanished. There was no explosion, no impact, not even a flicker. It was cleanly and silently unwritten from existence. The light washed over her position, and the world died. The deafening roar of the helicopter's rotors, the frantic chatter on the radio, the hum of the electronics, all of it ceased. Her chopper hung motionless in the sky, suspended in a sea of silent, radiant white. She and her pilots were unharmed, but they were utterly, terrifyingly powerless, witnesses to a force that had just rendered their entire arsenal, their entire paradigm of warfare, as obsolete as a wooden spear. The assault was over. The very concept of an assault had been proven meaningless. Inside the heart of the white void, the torrent of information in Adrian's mind calmed, coalescing into a coherent, singular presence. The alien consciousness was no longer screaming. It was speaking, not in words, but in pure, empathic concept. It showed him who they were. They were not creatures of flesh and bone, not biological life as he understood it. They were beings of pure information, intricate patterns of consciousness woven directly into the mathematical fabric of their universe. They were the universe's thoughts, its living equations. And their universe was forgetting itself. The collapse, the great unraveling, was a form of cosmic dementia. The laws that held their patterns together were failing, and their very existence, their minds, their memories, were being erased into the static of entropy. The gateway, he was made to understand, was not a physical door. The white light was the bridge itself, a conduit not for matter or energy, but for pure consciousness. They were not seeking to come through in ships or bodies. They were seeking to transfer the essential data of their being, to imprint their conscious patterns onto the substrate of a new, more stable reality. They were asking for refuge, not on a planet, but within the vast, untapped complexities of our universe. In the quantum foam, in the heart of stars, in the silent, empty spaces between the galaxies. They were seeking a symbiotic merger, an escape from oblivion into a new form of existence. It was not an invasion. It was an appeal for asylum on the most fundamental level. As this understanding bloomed in Adrian's mind, the light began to recede. As swiftly and silently as it had appeared, the sphere of whiteness collapsed back in on itself, draining back into the now perfectly stable, softly humming resonator. For Colonel Rostova, the world roared back to life. The helicopter's engines, which had never truly stopped spinning, bit into the air again. The radios crackled. The pilots shouted in confusion and terror. She looked out at the mountain. The impossible beam of light was gone. The gaping hole remained, but the machine within now glowed with a gentle, steady, peaceful light. She grabbed her secure radio, her hands shaking. Her report would be simple. "All units, stand down," she commanded, her voice strained. "Mission is scrubbed. We are withdrawing. The target is non-terrestrial and benign." Her career might be over, but she knew with utter certainty that she had just prevented her government from committing an act of cosmic folly. In the lab, the brilliant white faded, leaving the air calm and still. The hole in the wall was a gaping wound, but through it, the night sky seemed profoundly peaceful, the stars sharper and clearer than before. The resonator hummed with a soft, harmonic chime, its two rings spinning in a slow, graceful, and perfectly stable dance. The crisis was over. Maya and Julian stood speechless, trembling from the after-effects of an experience their minds could not categorize. They had not witnessed an event, they had been a part of it. Adrian stumbled back from the machine, his knees weak, his eyes wide with the sheer, soul-altering magnitude of what he now knew. He looked at Julian's ambition, at Maya's fear, and he understood that all of it was based on a profound misunderstanding. He looked at his two stunned colleagues, the only other living souls who had shared this moment. "They're here," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper filled with a terrifying, beautiful awe. "At the other end of the bridge. It's open. They are waiting." He took a shuddering breath. "They're asking for permission to cross." The great, external conflict was over. But the true final decision, a choice that would define the future of two universes, now rested entirely on their shoulders. Adrian's words, the final, impossible summary of their situation, settled in the quiet lab. "They're asking for permission to cross." The military was gone, the threat of destruction had vanished, but they were left with a choice far heavier than any weapon could impose. They stood before the softly humming resonator, no longer a machine, but a doorway, a silent threshold between two universes. It was Maya who finally broke the reverent silence. Her voice, when she spoke, was not panicked, but filled with a scientist's desperate need for definition. "Permission?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the gently spinning rings. "How do we even begin to grant permission? What are the terms? What is the procedure for negotiating an interdimensional asylum treaty?" Her questions, though tinged with an understandable absurdity, were the anchor of reason they desperately needed. Adrian, feeling the gentle, patient presence of the alien consciousness still resonating in his mind, tried to translate the untranslatable. "It's not a negotiation," he explained softly. "It's an invitation. They aren't asking to come here in a physical sense. There are no bodies, no ships. They are patterns of information. They are asking permission to merge." He struggled to find the right words to describe the concepts the machine was feeding him. Our universe, our reality, is incredibly stable and complex. It's filled with unused space. Not physical space, but informational space. The quantum foam, the background radiation, the infinite complexity of physical law itself. They are asking to imprint their consciousness there, to exist as a part of the universe's complexity, not as a parasite, but as a symbiotic presence. A new layer of meaning on top of the raw physics of our world. The idea was staggering. Not an influx of aliens, but an infusion of souls. An act of preservation so profound it bordered on the spiritual. Julian had been silent throughout, his gaze locked on the gateway. The man who had sought to control the ultimate technology, to be the gatekeeper, to hold the keys to the universe, was now confronted with a truth his ambition could not conquer. He couldn't own this. He couldn't weaponize it. He couldn't control it. He could only allow it or deny it. His entire life had been a quest for power over the unknown. Now, he was being offered a chance for a partnership with it. He let out a long, slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was stripped of all its familiar arrogance, replaced by a quiet wonder he hadn't known since he was a boy staring at the stars. For my whole life, he said, more to himself than to them, I have treated the universe as a problem to be solved, a lock to be picked. This is the first thing I've ever encountered that doesn't want to be solved. It just wants to be welcomed. In that moment, the billionaire, the industrialist, the ruthless tactician, fell away, leaving only a man humbled by a scale of existence he had never imagined. His surrender was the final piece. Maya looked from Julian's transformed expression to Adrian's earnest, pleading face. Her fear had been of a physical contamination, of a chaotic force upsetting the delicate balance of her world. But this was different. An integration of pure consciousness. It was the ultimate act of information sharing, the most profound data transfer in history. The risks were still immeasurable, the consequences unknowable. But she now understood that the risk of committing a silent, cosmic atrocity, of turning away 1 trillion souls at the door to oblivion, was infinitely greater. Their humanity, she realized, was defined not by their ability to protect themselves, but by their capacity to welcome another. They looked at each other. The theorist, the pragmatist, and the visionary. The three unlikely arbiters of two universes. No vote was needed. No formal declaration had to be spoken. In the silent, shared understanding of that moment, a unanimous, heartfelt consensus was reached. They would say yes. Adrian turned back to the softly glowing gateway. He didn't need the console. He knew the machine was connected to all of them now, waiting for their unified intent. He, Maya, and Julian stood together, focusing their collective will, their fear, their hope, and their final, unified decision into a single powerful concept. Adrian acted as the conduit, the final emissary. He took a deep breath and sent the thought, pure, simple, and from the very core of his being, into the heart of the machine. Welcome. In response, the gentle hum of the resonator deepened, not into a roar of power, but into a warm, resonant, harmonic chord that filled the room with a sense of profound peace. The light within the spinning rings brightened, not with a blinding, violent flash, but with a soft, inviting, golden glow. From the very center of the gateway, a slow, silent river of iridescent, intangible light began to flow. It was like a cosmic aurora, a stream of liquid starlight pouring gently into their world. It carried no heat, no force, no substance. It was a river of pure consciousness, the silent, grateful migration of a civilization, finally crossing the impossible bridge into their new home. The light washed over them, and in it, they felt not an invasion, but a joining. A quiet, joyful whisper added to the noise of their universe. They stood bathed in the miraculous glow, no longer gatekeepers or soldiers or scientists, but the welcoming committee for a new and beautiful form of existence in the cosmos. The world did not change overnight. There were no grand announcements, no alien ships filling the sky, no sudden, miraculous transformations. The silent river of consciousness that had flowed through the gateway in the heart of the mountain spread out into the vast, complex ocean of our reality and, for the most part, disappeared. The human world, with its noise and politics and relentless forward motion, seemed to continue on, blissfully unaware that it was now home to the silent, thinking ghosts of a dead universe. But slowly, subtly, the ripples began to spread. A year after the event that came to be known only as the Awakening, the facility in the Colorado mountains was no longer a secret fortress. The gaping hole in its side had been replaced by a vast, panoramic window of reinforced quartz, and the site had been reborn as the Vance Institute for Interdimensional Studies. At its heart, the resonator, the gateway, remained active, a shimmering, stable curtain of silent, iridescent light, a permanent monument to the day two universes had touched. The change to the world was not in what people saw, but in how they saw. An astronomer in Chile, mapping the cosmic microwave background, found an impossibly intricate pattern hidden deep within the static, a fractal of such complexity it seemed to contain a language. A biologist in Tokyo, studying the so-called junk DNA of a simple organism, discovered a new layer of encoded information, a system of organization that was elegant, efficient, and had not been there in any previous sample. Artists, musicians, and poets around the globe began to speak of a new and profound current of inspiration, of ideas and melodies that seemed to flow not from their own minds, but from a deeper, quieter source. The world had not been invaded. It had been enriched. The refugees had kept their promise, weaving their consciousness into the silent, unused spaces, adding their voices to the quiet symphony of existence. The three people who had stood at the epicenter of this change found new purposes in the world they had helped to create. Maya Collins, once the cautious pragmatist, was now the Institute's lead researcher, a pioneer in a field that hadn't existed a year ago. She stood before a holographic chart displaying the cosmic background radiation, pointing out the newly discovered patterns to a visiting Nobel laureate. "We spent a century calling this noise," she said, a smile touching her lips. "Now, we're finally learning to read the poetry." Julian Croft, the man who had sought to control everything, had finally found a purpose in letting go. He had liquidated the majority of his corporate empire and poured his vast fortune into a new foundation dedicated to the ethical stewardship of the new knowledge. He spent his days not in boardrooms, but in diplomatic meetings, arguing before the United Nations for a global pact to ensure that the secrets of the Gateway would be shared by all of humanity, not hoarded by any single nation. His ambition, once aimed at ownership, was now aimed at preservation and partnership. And Adrian Vance, the disgraced astronomer who had first heard the whisper in the static, had become the quiet center of their new world. He spent much of his time in the main chamber, not with instruments or data, but in silent communion before the shimmering gateway. The connection was no longer a painful, overwhelming torrent, but a peaceful, constant dialogue. He was learning the history of a civilization that had measured its lifespan in the lifetime of a universe, their sorrows and joys, their discoveries and their art. He was no longer just a scientist. He was an ambassador, a student, and a friend. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was joined by a familiar figure. Agent Marcus Sterling, now a civilian liaison between the Institute and the world's governments, stood beside him, looking out the massive window at the setting sun. "They're still afraid, you know," Sterling said quietly. "The people in Washington, in Moscow, in Beijing. They can't understand it, so they fear it. But they can't deny the results." He gestured vaguely at the world beyond the window. "Global tensions are at a 50-year low. We're seeing a boom in creative and scientific output unlike anything in human history. They're terrified of the cause, but they're falling in love with the effect." Sterling had become the Gateway's unlikely guardian, his reports to the powerful a constant, calming voice that held their fear at bay. Adrian nodded, his gaze fixed on the shimmering curtain of light. "They were afraid of being alone in the universe," he said. "And now they're afraid of not being alone. They'll understand, eventually." He turned his gaze back to the Gateway. In his mind's eye, through the connection he shared, he could feel the vast, beautiful, and now interconnected web of existence. He could feel the new consciousness, not as a foreign presence, but as a part of everything. A quiet hum of intelligence in the heart of a star, a flicker of awareness in a blade of grass, a new depth of potential in the human mind. The universe was no longer a vast, cold, and empty space. It was alive, and it was singing. The lonely radio signal he had found in the desert of West Texas had not just been a message from another dimension. It had been the universe's ultimate act of hope. An invitation, sent across the abyss, to finally join a greater conversation. And humanity, in its fear and its courage and its compassion, had at long last chosen to answer.